In 1945, the United States government made a secret deal to bring over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians into the country. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is in the declassified files. The men they brought over had designed weapons for the Third Reich. They had worked in concentration camps. They had sworn oaths to Hitler. And they were given new lives, new identities, and new jobs. Some of them are still alive. Tonight, we're going through the entire story of Operation Paperclip, what the deal really was, who made it, and the one classified memo that proves they knew exactly what they were doing. You know the official story. You probably heard it in school or in some documentary that played in the background while you were doing something else. It goes like this. The war in Europe ends in May of 1945. The Allies have won. But in the Pacific, the fight against Japan is still raging. It's brutal, it's bloody, and American commanders are looking at the prospect of a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands. They're projecting 1 million American casualties, maybe more. At the same time, American and British intelligence teams are fanning out across a shattered Germany. They're not just looking for hidden gold or secret bunkers. They're looking for brains. Specifically, the brains that built the Nazi war machine. Because while the Allies were building thousands of reliable tanks and planes, the Germans were building things that seemed to come from another century. Jet fighters that could fly 500 miles an hour while Allied prop planes struggled to hit 400. Rocket-powered missiles that could fly from Germany and land on London without a pilot. Advanced nerve gases, new kinds of submarines. The technical leap was undeniable, and it was terrifying. The men who built these things weren't just engineers. They were assets. And in the summer of 1945, they were up for grabs. The Soviet Red Army is doing the exact same thing, just a few miles to the east. They're rounding up their own list of German scientists. This isn't just about ending the war with Japan anymore. This is about the next war. The one everyone already sees coming, the one that will be fought between the United States and the Soviet Union. A Cold War fought with very hot technology. So the official story says that American military leaders, men like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, faced a terrible but necessary choice. They could let these brilliant minds fall into Soviet hands, giving Stalin the keys to the Nazi rocket and chemical weapons programs. Or they could bring them to America. Deny the enemy a resource. Use that resource for ourselves. It's framed as a grim calculus, a lesser of two evils, the needs of national security outweighing the complications of a man's past. We needed their knowledge to save American lives in the Pacific. We needed their knowledge to secure the peace against the Soviets. It was a dirty job, but someone had to do it. And we were the ones who did it. That's the story. It's clean. It's logical. It has a kind of ruthless geopolitical clarity to it. You can almost hear the narrator of that old documentary saying it, over footage of V-2 rockets being assembled. In the interest of national security, a difficult decision was made. But here's the part they always leave out when they tell you that story, the part that should bother you. They didn't just recruit rocket scientists from clean research labs. The Nazi war machine wasn't built in a sterile, academic vacuum. It was built on a foundation of slave labor, of plundered resources, and of a specific, state-sanctioned ideology that viewed entire groups of people as subhuman, as raw material for experimentation. The V-2 rocket, that technological marvel, wasn't built by well-paid technicians in white coats. It was built by starving prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, worked to death in underground tunnels. More people died building the V2 than were killed by it as a weapon. That's a historical fact. The man who ran that program, who toured those tunnels, who saw those conditions, was a specific person. His name was Wernher von Braun. And in the summer of 1945, Wernher von Braun wasn't hiding in a bunker. He wasn't on the run. He and his entire team of top Peenemünde rocket scientists had made a calculated decision. They packed up their families and their research papers, and they drove south, through the collapsing German lines, straight into the arms of the American 44th Infantry Division. They surrendered. Voluntarily. Think about that for a second. The mastermind of the Nazi rocket program, a man who held the rank of Asterisk SS Sturmbannführer in the Nazi paramilitary, didn't try to disappear. He went looking for the Americans because he knew what he had, and he knew what it was worth. So when the U.S. Army found him, they didn't throw him in a prisoner of war camp. They didn't interrogate him as a war criminal. They put him and his men in a comfortable hotel in Bavaria. They fed them steaks and eggs, food that was a luxury in starving post-war Europe, and they started debriefing them, not about war crimes, about rocket science. The official story says this was all about the immediate threat of Japan and the long-term threat of the Soviets. And that's part of it, but there's another layer, a quieter, more bureaucratic layer. Back in Washington, a specific office within the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already drawn up a plan. It was called the Exploitation of German Specialists in Science and Technology in the United States. The name is a mouthful. The intent was simple: identify them, screen them, and get them stateside. Fast, but there was a problem. A very big, very legal problem. President Truman had signed a directive. It was clear. It said no person who had been a member of the Nazi Party or who had actively supported Nazi militarism would be allowed to enter the United States. The directive was meant to keep war criminals out. It was meant to be a line in the sand. So you have a presidential order saying no Nazis. And you have a military and intelligence apparatus saying, we need these Nazis. What do? You change the paperwork. This is where the operation gets its name, Paperclip, because the officers in charge of the files would attach a simple paperclip to the dossier of a German scientist they wanted to fast-track, a visual signal. But the paperclip also symbolizes something else, the act of clipping together a new version of a man's history, of papering over the inconvenient parts. The military intelligence teams conducting the initial screenings were under immense pressure. Their job was to produce usable scientists, not to dig up war crimes. So the reports started to get creative. A man's membership in the Nazi Party, listed as nominal. His rank in the SS, omitted or described as honorary. His direct supervision of slave laborers, never mentioned. They weren't just hiding these details from the public. They were hiding them from the State Department, from the immigration officials whose job it was to enforce Truman's directive. They were creating two sets of books, one for the official record, clean and whitewashed, and another, more truthful set, locked away in classified intelligence files. Now, you'd think someone would have caught this. You'd think a process this big, involving this many people, would have had checks and balances. Someone in the State Department would have asked a hard question. Someone in the FBI would have dug deeper. But here, where it gets weird. The momentum was too great. The fear of the Soviets was too fresh. The lure of the technology was too strong. And a specific argument began to circulate in the halls of the Pentagon and the fledgling Central Intelligence Agency. It was an argument that would become the moral loophole for everything that followed. The argument went like this: these men are not ideologues, they are not true Nazis, they are apolitical, they are pure scientists. Their only loyalty is to their work, to the rocket, to the missile, to the chemical formula. The Nazi regime simply gave them the funding and the workforce to pursue their research. They would have worked for anyone. Pure scientists. It's a powerful idea. It separates the mind from the man. It says the knowledge itself is clean, neutral, value-free. That it can be extracted from the moral filth of its creation, like gold panned from a dirty river. But is that true? Can you separate the man who designed a system from the system that used slave labor to build it? Can you welcome the mind while ignoring what the hands attached to that mind had signed off on? The official story says yes. It says we had to. National security demanded it. But by the fall of 1945, the war with Japan was over. The atomic bombs had been dropped. The immediate justification, using Nazi science to avoid a bloody invasion, was gone. Yet the project to bring the scientists to America didn't slow down. It accelerated. Because the real prize was never about ending the last war. It was about winning the next one. And in a top-secret facility in the New Mexico desert, a place called White Sands, they were already laying the groundwork. They were going to rebuild the German rocket program, from the ground up, with the original architects in charge. But before those men could set foot on American soil, their files had to be cleaned. And to clean a file, you first have to know what's dirty. You have to know what you're hiding. Which means someone somewhere had to look at the unvarnished truth about these men, their party memberships, their SS ranks, their activities during the war. Someone had to read those reports and make a conscious decision to erase them. That person was an Army intelligence officer named Major James P. Hamill. And the memo he wrote in the spring of 1947, that memo is the key. It's the one document that doesn't just hint at the cover-up. It lays it out in cold, bureaucratic language. It admits the problem, and then it provides the solution. Because in that memo, Hamill wasn't worried about morality. He was worried about procedure. He was worried the State Department would find out. And he had a plan to make sure they didn't. The ships were already being prepared. The scientists and their families were being gathered at a port in Germany. They were about to cross the Atlantic to start their new lives. But their old lives, the ones filled with uncomfortable facts, were supposed to stay behind in a locked file cabinet in Europe. The official story was ready. It was clean, logical, and necessary. But the real story, the one in the basement at Peenemünde, and in the tunnels of Middle Baudora, that story was waiting. And it was about to follow them home. So you've got this picture in your head now. The war is over. The rockets are sitting there, half buried in the German countryside or laid out on factory floors like giant, sinister trophies. And the men who built them are just gone, vanished. The official story, the one they gave you in school, says we rounded them up, we interrogated them, we took their notes. End of story. The technology was the prize, but that's not the whole story. It's not even the right story. The real story starts earlier. And it starts with a question nobody in power wanted to ask out loud. Because if you asked it, you'd have to answer it. And the answer was going to be ugly. The question was this: what do you do with the men who built the machines of hell? We need to go back before the fall, to a place called Peenemünde. It's a remote spot on the Baltic coast of Germany. To the outside world, maybe it's a research station. But inside, it's a kingdom. A kingdom ruled by a man named Wernher von Braun. Young. Charismatic, a visionary. He's the one who sold Hitler on the dream of rockets, long-range missiles, weapons that could fly over armies, over navies, and land right on London. He wasn't just an engineer, he was a salesman, and he was very, very good at his job. Now the rockets themselves, they're a technical marvel. That part is undeniable. The V-2 was the first long-range guided ballistic missile. It flew to the edge of space. It was the future, made of steel and liquid fuel. But here's the part they always skip when they talk about the genius. They never show you the basement, because Peenemünde had a basement, not a metaphorical one, a real one. A massive underground factory called Mittelwerk. And to build these miracles of engineering, von Braun and his team needed workers, lots of them. They didn't hire them. They didn't post ads. They used slaves. We're talking about concentration camp prisoners, from Dora, from Buchenwald. People worked to death, starved, beaten, executed on the spot for sabotage or for just moving too slowly. The mortality rate was industrial. They died by the thousands in those tunnels assembling von Braun's rockets. He knew, of course he knew, he visited. He saw the conditions. He signed requisition orders for more slaves. His rockets were built on a mountain of corpses, and he never once, not in any memo, not in any diary entry we've found, expressed a single ethical doubt about the source of his labor. His concern was always the rocket, always the next test, always the technical problem. So let's be clear about who we're dealing with here. This isn't some apolitical scientist locked in an ivory tower. This is a man who willingly, eagerly, worked for the most murderous regime in modern history. He wore the SS uniform. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer A Major. He partied with Himmler. He got his resources, and he delivered his weapons. Now, fast forward to 1945, the war is ending. Von Braun is smart. He sees the writing on the wall. He makes a calculation. He gathers his top team, about 120 of the best minds from Peenemünde, and they make a run for it. They're not running from the Americans. They're running to asterisk them. They have a plan. They have documents hidden in a mine. They have a bargaining chip. And it works. An American private finds him. Von Braun's brother, Magnus, approaches the soldier and says in broken English, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." Think about the sheer audacity of that. You've just spent years building weapons that killed thousands of civilians in Allied cities. Your workforce was a death camp, and your opening line is, "We want a deal." And the Americans, they listen. Why? Because while the infantrymen are seeing the horror of the camps being liberated, a different kind of officer is arriving in Europe. These men aren't from the army. They're from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And they're not interested in war crimes. They're interested in brains. They have lists. Classified lists with code names like Overcast and later, Paperclip. Their mission is simple. Find the German scientists before the Russians do and get them out. But here's the problem in the basement. It's not a technical problem. It's a moral one, and it's about to become a legal one. President Truman had been clear. He signed a policy directive. It said, and I'm paraphrasing here, no former members of the Nazi Party, no active supporters of the Nazi regime are to be brought to the United States. Period. The directive was unambiguous. It was a line in the sand. So you have a direct order from the commander-in-chief. And you have a group of men in the field, intelligence officers, military liaisons, looking at Wernher von Braun and his team, looking at their SS files, looking at their party membership numbers, and then looking at the half-built V-2s and the blueprints for things even more advanced, ideas for rockets that could reach the upper atmosphere, for missiles that could cross oceans. The men in the field have a choice. They can follow the order, or they can get the scientists. They choose the scientists. But to do that, they have to make the problem in the basement disappear. They have to whitewash the records. They have to create a new story. A story where Wernher von Braun wasn't a willing servant of the Reich, but a reluctant genius, a man forced into his work, a visionary whose mind was too valuable to lose. A story where the thousands who died in the Mittelwerk tunnels are just an unfortunate footnote, a tragedy of war, nothing to do with the man who requisitioned them. You'd think someone would have stopped this, right? You'd think a military lawyer, a State Department official, someone would have looked at these dossiers and said, "We have a policy. This man is a Nazi officer. The answer is no." But nobody did, because a new war was already starting, a Cold War. And in that war, the rules were different. The enemy wasn't fascism anymore. The enemy was communism. And if the Nazis had tools that could help you fight communists, well, suddenly the problem in the basement looked less like a crime and more like a bureaucratic inconvenience. So the officers on the ground got to work. They began processing the files. Incriminating documents were lost. Friendly interviews were conducted. Von Braun and his team were coached on what to say, how to frame their past. They were to be presented as technical assets, their political affiliations minimized, explained away as necessary for survival. The goal was to build a new biography, one that would fit on an immigration form and satisfy a distracted bureaucrat back in Washington. But the real problem in the basement wasn't the paperwork. It was the knowledge. It was the cold, calculated decision that some men, because of what they knew, were above the law, that their past could be edited, that the moral ledger of the war could have one column for crimes and another, entirely separate column for useful criminals. We were no longer just taking rocket parts. We were making a deal. And to make that deal, we first had to agree to forget what we saw in the basement. We had to agree that the future was more important than the past. The men with the lists were very good at their jobs. They were about to prove it. Because the next step was to find the one person who could identify every valuable scientist in Germany and convince him to work for us, too. So we've got the official story, the one they gave you in school. And we've seen the real problem sitting in the basement at Peenemünde, the V2, a weapon built by slaves, a terror from the sky. The war in Europe is ending. The Soviets are closing in from the east. The Americans are pushing in from the west. And in the middle of it all, in the chaos of a collapsing regime, are the men who built that terror. Now, you'd think the plan would be simple. Find these men. Arrest them. Put them on trial for what they did. That's the clean, moral line, right? The one you draw after you've won a war against pure evil. But that's not the plan. The plan is something else entirely. And the plan needs a man to make it work. It needs a man who can see a rocket scientist and not see a war criminal. It needs a man who can look at a mountain of files and see, not guilt, but a shopping list. That man was Major Robert B. Staver. Staver was an engineer. He wasn't a spook, not yet. He was with the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, and his job in the spring of 1945 was technical intelligence. Go into the shattered remains of the German war machine, figure out what they had, and report back. Simple. But Staver had a specific, burning interest: rockets. He'd seen the reports from London, the craters left by the V2s. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the American military at that moment, that this wasn't just another weapon. This was the next war. And the men who built it were the keys to that future. So as the Third Reich implodes, Staver isn't just wandering through ruins. He's on a hunt, a very specific hunt. He's not looking for gold or secret treaties. He's looking for personnel files, resumes, laboratory rosters, anything with a name on it. He ends up at a place called Nordhausen. It's in the Harz Mountains, a massive underground factory called Mittelwerk. This is where the V2s were assembled. By the time Staver gets there, the place has been captured by American troops. But he's not there to liberate the few surviving slave laborers, emaciated and dying. He's there for the paperwork. He finds it. He finds the mother lode. Thousands of personnel records just sitting there. The bureaucratic footprint of the entire German rocket program. Names, addresses, specialties, security clearances. A directory of genius built on a foundation of corpses. And this is where Staver makes his move. He doesn't just catalog these files. He doesn't just send them up the chain of command with a neutral report. He starts making a list, his own list. He sits down, probably in some requisitioned German office with a busted window, and he goes through those names. He's not a prosecutor. He's a talent scout. He's asking himself one question, and one question only: who do we need? Werner von Braun is at the top, of course, the boy wonder, the charismatic leader. But Staver knows von Braun can't do it alone. He needs his team. He needs the propulsion specialist, the guidance expert, the aerodynamics wizard. Staver writes them down. One by one. Arthur Rudolph, who ran the Mittelwerk factory floor. Kurt Debus, the launch operations genius. Walter Dornberger, the military commander of the whole program. Dozens of names. Now here's the part that should bother you. Staver wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was a major. He had superiors. He filed reports. So the question is, what did those reports say? Did he mention the conditions at Mittelwerk? The thousands of dead? The slavery? Or did he just talk about thrust ratios and gyroscopic controls? The story goes that Staver wrote a memo. A famous memo. It's dated April 26, 1945. In it, he doesn't mince words about the value of what he's found. He says capturing these men is second in importance only to the defeat of Germany. Let that sink in. Second in importance only to winning the war itself. He argues that if we don't get them, the Soviets will. And then he lays it out. We need to find them, we need to secure them, and we need to bring them to the United States for, quote, permanent residence. Permanent residence. This isn't a plan for interrogation. This isn't a temporary debrief. This is an immigration proposal for the men who built the V2. But Staver is just a major. He can write all the memos he wants. To make this happen, he needs authority. He needs someone higher up to look at his list and say, yes, do it. That someone was Colonel Holger Toft. Toft was the chief of the Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence Team. He was Staver's boss. And when Staver brought him the list, when he made his pitch, Toft didn't hesitate. He saw the same thing Staver saw, not war criminals, assets. He approved the plan. He gave it a name, a dry, bureaucratic name that hid its true scale, Operation Overcast. The original idea was to bring about 100 German scientists and engineers to the U.S. for a limited time, 6 months maybe, to be exploited for their knowledge. That was the cover story. A temporary consulting gig. But you and I, we can look at that and see the thin edge of the wedge. Because once you've decided that a man's knowledge is so valuable that you're willing to ignore his past, what's to stop you from keeping him? Permanently? So the list exists, the authority exists, but there's a problem. A big, messy, on-the-ground problem. Germany is in pieces. The scientists on Staver's list aren't sitting in their offices waiting for a job offer. They're running. They're hiding. Some are trying to get to the American lines, fearing the Soviets. Some are lying low, hoping to blend into the countryside. Some, like von Braun, have been ordered by the SS to hide in the Alps and be ready to be executed rather than captured. Staver and Toft have a list of names, but they don't have the men. They need to find them. And they need to find them before the Soviets do, before the British do, before the French do, before anyone else asks the wrong questions. This turns into a shadow war, a quiet, desperate scramble in the closing days of the real war. American intelligence officers, often just kids who spoke a little German, are given copies of Staver's list and sent out into the chaos. Their orders: find these men, protect them, bring them in. Imagine that scene. A young lieutenant knocking on the door of a battered farmhouse. A German man answers, wary, frightened. The lieutenant doesn't arrest him. He doesn't read him his rights. He says, "Are you Dr. So-and-so, the rocket specialist? We've been looking for you. We have a job for you in America. Pack a bag." What must that have felt like? For the scientist, it's salvation. For the lieutenant, it's just orders. But nobody is asking, what did you do to earn this salvation? Staver's list was the blueprint. It turned individuals into inventory. It reduced moral questions to a simple check mark next to a name. And with that list in hand, the Americans began to round up their prize. But they couldn't just put them on a ship. There was a story to sell back home, a lie to tell. And that lie started with the very first thing they decided to take, which wasn't the scientists at all. They said they only wanted the data, just the harmless paper secrets. The scientists, they were just the filing cabinets you had to bring along to read the files. That was the first lie. And it was the one that made all the others possible. So the list was made, and the man who made it, John Gimble, was sitting in a room in London with a problem. It was the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich was a pile of rubble and ash, and in that rubble were the men on his list. The problem wasn't finding them. The problem was what to do with them once you did. Because here's the thing they don't tell you about the end of a war. The paperwork is a nightmare. You have millions of displaced people. You have prisoners of war. You have collaborators and war criminals and refugees all mixed together in this human soup. And you have a set of rules written in Geneva and in various treaties about how you're supposed to handle them. The rules are very clear, especially about the enemy. And the men on Gimble's list were the enemy, not just soldiers. They were the architects. The men who designed the V-2 rocket that rained down on London, the weapon built by slave labor in the hellish tunnels of Middlework. Their hands weren't necessarily dirty with blood in the direct, personal way of an SS guard. Their crime was colder, more clinical. They made the machine work. They were, by any reasonable definition, Nazis. And the official policy of the United States government, repeated in public statements and internal memos, was that Nazis were to be dealt with, denazified, punished. But Gimble wasn't looking for men to punish. He was looking for men to use. And this is where we get to the first lie. The foundational lie. The one they told to get the whole thing moving. It was a lie of focus, a lie of intention. They didn't call it a lie, of course. They called it a policy, a distinction. The public story, the one for the newspapers and for Congress, was that we were in a race against the Soviets for the spoils of war. And the biggest spoils weren't gold or art. They were brains, scientific brains. The narrative was simple. The Germans were ahead of us in rocketry, in aerodynamics, in a dozen fields. We had to get their scientists before the Russians did. It was a matter of national security. You've probably heard that version. It's clean. It's strategic. It makes a kind of brutal Cold War sense. But that wasn't the real pitch. Not inside the rooms where these things were decided. The real pitch The one that circulated in classified cables and hushed conversations between military intelligence and the Joint Chiefs was different. It was narrower, more cynical. They didn't want the asterisk scientists. They wanted the asterisk data. Think about that for a second. It sounds like semantics, but it's everything. If you want the scientist, you're bringing over a person. A person with a past, with a family, with political affiliations, with a file that might contain inconvenient truths. A person needs denazification hearings. A person needs a visa. A person can talk. But data is clean. Data is quiet. Data is just paper and film and microfiche. You can ship it in a crate. You can file it in a vault. It doesn't have a party membership card. It doesn't have a conscience. It just is asterisk. The argument went like this: we can interview the scientists. We can interrogate them. We can squeeze every last equation, every wind tunnel result, every fuel mixture ratio out of them. We can take their notebooks, their prototypes, their test models. And then we send them back. We let the denazification tribunals have them. We let the legal process, whatever that might be in a shattered Germany, run its course. We get what we need from them, not with asterisk them. It was a neat moral loophole. We weren't hiring Nazis. We were asterisk exploiting asterisk them. We were taking their work as reparations. The man himself was just the temporary vessel for that information. Once emptied, the vessel could be discarded. This was the plan, at least on paper. You'd think someone would have noticed the flaw, right? The human flaw. Let's say you're Werner von Braun or any of his team. You're in a detention camp. An American officer shows you a list of questions, deep, technical questions about your life's work. He wants to know everything. And he says, help us and it will go better for you. But he also says officially that when he's done, you'll be handed over to the authorities. Would you tell him everything? Would you hold back the most precious insights, the real breakthroughs, the things you alone understand? Of course you would. You'd bargain. You'd make yourself indispensable. Data doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in the minds of the men who created it. The real secrets, the instincts, the failed experiments that taught them what not asterisk to do, the untested theories, those aren't in the notebooks. They're in the head. And you can't get what's in a man's head unless he wants to give it to you. So the men on the list, they figured this out immediately. They weren't prisoners being drained of information. They were assets in negotiation. Their knowledge was their currency, and they started spending it, carefully. They gave just enough to show their value. They hinted at greater things to come. They made it clear that the data, the asterisk, real asterisk data, was a living thing, and it traveled with them. And back in Washington and in the forward headquarters in Europe, the military men started to realize the same thing. You couldn't just mine these men like a vein of ore. The ore talked back. It made demands. It had conditions. This is the quiet pivot. The moment the first lie began to curdle. The policy of we just want the data began to bump up against the reality of human beings. And the reality was, to get the best data, the complete data, you needed to keep the human being happy. You needed to protect him. You needed to relocate him. But you couldn't just say that. Not yet. The public wasn't ready for it. The world wasn't ready for it. The ghosts of Auschwitz and Buchenwald were too fresh, so they needed a bridge, a way to move from exploiting enemies to employing them. They found that bridge in the most bureaucratic way possible. They changed the questions. Instead of asking, "Were you a member of the Nazi Party?" A question with a very simple, often incriminating yes or no answer, they began asking softer questions. Did you join under duress? Were you merely a technical specialist, separate from politics? Did you disagree with the regime's excesses? The forms were redesigned. The interviews were guided. And here's the part that should bother you. Nobody at the top gave a direct order to whitewash these men. There was no smoking gun memo that said, "Ignore the war crimes." It was subtler. It was a shift in priority. The priority was no longer justice or even exploitation. The priority was acquisition. Get the brains, get the work. Everything else was a complication to be managed. And when your sole priority is acquisition, you start to see every moral or legal obstacle not as a barrier, but as a paperwork problem. So the dossiers on these scientists began to transform. Incriminating details were minimized. Glowing assessments of their technical genius were emphasized. Their Nazi Party membership was reframed as a necessary career move, a sad reality of life in Hitler's Germany. They weren't ideologues, they were asterisk pragmatists. They weren't complicit, they were asterisk focused on their work. The man who made the list, Gimbel, he saw this happening. He was a middleman watching the product he'd identified become more valuable than the rules governing its transfer. And the pressure was coming from the highest levels, not from shadowy figures, but from generals, from the Department of War. The message was clear: find them, evaluate them, and make them available. The how was becoming someone else's problem. And that someone else was usually a man in the field, an intelligence officer face-to-face with a brilliant, charming, deeply compromised German engineer who was offering him the keys to the next decade of military dominance. What would you do? Follow the black and white rules from a manual written before anyone knew what a V2 was? Or get the prize? By the late summer of 1945, the pretense was wearing thin. The data-only policy was a fiction everyone was still reciting, but nobody in the operational chain was following. They were already hiding scientists. They were already stashing them in safe houses, giving them false paperwork, moving them between camps to keep them away from the official war crimes investigators who were starting to ask their own, much less friendly, questions. The lie had served its purpose. It had gotten the machinery moving. It had provided a plausible, somewhat defensible starting point. But the machinery was now heading somewhere the lie couldn't cover. It was heading towards a much bigger, much more permanent decision. And that decision would require a new lie, a more active one. It would require someone to not just ignore the past, but to deliberately set it on fire. If you're the kind of person who likes knowing what really happened, subscribe. We dig into a new American mystery every single night. Because next, we have to talk about what happens when the paperwork itself becomes the target. When the evidence isn't just smoothed over but destroyed. The story turns to smoke, and one man, right in the middle of it, suddenly decides he can't look the other way. That's next time, in The Smell of Burning Paper and a Change of Heart. You'll want to hear what he saw go up in flames. So the list is made, the lie is told. The official position is that we want the data, not the men. But you and I, we're past that now. We know what's coming, the machinery is in motion. And in the spring of 1945, that machinery starts to arrive at the front lines. Not tanks, not infantry, a new kind of soldier. They called them the T-forces, technical forces. Their job wasn't to capture towns or hold ground. Their job was to capture things and people. They were the advanced scouts for Paperclip, though most of them didn't know that name. They had target lists. They had maps with red circles around factories, laboratories, university buildings. Their orders were simple: get there before the British, before the French, and especially before the Russians. Secure the site. Secure the personnel. And most importantly, secure the paper, because this was a paper war now. The physical rockets, the wind tunnels, the test stands, they were impressive, but they were just metal. The real treasure was in the filing cabinets, the design schematics, the wind tunnel data, the test flight reports, the personnel files that told you who built what and who knew which secret. This was the intellectual loot of the Third Reich, and the T-Forces were the treasure hunters. They moved in the wake of the combat troops, sometimes right behind the front lines. You'd have a scene of utter devastation, a town shattered by artillery, bodies in the streets, the smell of cordite and burning. And moving through it, calm as librarians, would be these teams of officers and engineers, asking directions to the local Aerodynamics Institute. And here's where it gets weird. They weren't just finding documents. They were finding documents that were supposed to be gone. The order from Berlin had been clear: destroy everything. Burn the files. Smash the prototypes. Don't let any of it fall into enemy hands. And in many places, that's exactly what they found: ash, piles of it. The smell of burning paper was the smell of a lost war, but not everywhere. Some scientists, you see, had a change of heart, or maybe they just had a change of strategy. The fanatics, the true believers, they followed orders. They burned their life's work. But others looked at the ash and thought about the future. Their future. If everything is destroyed, what value do you have? You're just another hungry face in the refugee crowd. But if you have something to trade, if you have the only complete set of wind tunnel data for a revolutionary wing design, well, then you're not a defeated enemy. You're a potential asset. So they hid them. They buried crates of documents in mines. They walled them up in cellar compartments. They gave them to farmers for safekeeping. They created their own insurance policies. And when the American T-Force officer showed up at their door, looking lost amid the rubble, they didn't say, "It's all burned." They said, "I might be able to help you, but it's dangerous. The SS might come back." They led the Americans on a little treasure hunt, a gesture of goodwill, a demonstration of value. Think about that moment. The power dynamic completely flips. The conqueror is now dependent on the conquered for access to the prize. The scientist, just days ago a part of the Nazi war machine, is now the helpful guide, the expert, the indispensable man. He's not surrendering. He's interviewing Asterisk. And the Americans played right into it. They needed these men to find the data, to identify it, to explain what the hell any of it meant. You can't just ship 10 tons of German technical documents to Washington and hope someone figures it out. You need the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone had a name, and it was wearing a worn-out suit and asking for a cigarette. This is the unspoken deal that starts to form in those ruined German towns in the spring of 1945. It's not signed on any paper. It's understood. You help us find what we want. We'll make sure you're comfortable. Comfortable meant extra rations. It meant a scientist armband to protect you from being rounded up as a regular POW. It meant, eventually, a ticket out. But not everyone was on board with this new, cozy arrangement. Remember, the T-Forces were military. Many of them had just fought their way across Europe. They'd seen the concentration camps being liberated. They'd seen the evidence. And now their orders were to treat some of the architects of that horror with kid gloves, to share their rations with them. There's a story, and it's one of those stories that feels too pointed not to have some truth to it, about a young T-Force lieutenant. He arrives at a research facility. He's met by a polite, English-speaking German scientist who is all too eager to help. The scientist leads him to a hidden cache of documents, priceless stuff. The lieutenant is supposed to be grateful. But as the scientist is proudly explaining the intricacies of, say, a high-pressure fuel valve, the lieutenant looks past him. out the window. To the slave labor camp that was attached to the facility, the empty, ragged barracks, the silent gallows. The lieutenant turns back to the scientist, who is still talking about valve tolerances, and the lieutenant just stops listening. He sees the equation now. This beautiful, precise technical data in his hands, it was written in the currency of starvation and whippings and hangings. The paper had a stain on it that no amount of technical genius could bleach out. What did that lieutenant do? The story doesn't say. Probably nothing he could do. His orders were to secure the data and the scientist. He followed his orders, but you have to wonder about the smell in that room. The smell of old paper and ink, and underneath it, maybe, the lingering smell of the camp that still hung in the air. Two kinds of smoke. One from burned files, one from burned bodies. That's the conflict that was baked into Paperclip from the very first handshake in a bombed-out lab. A moral dissonance. The American officers on the ground, the ones with the dirt and the grief still on their boots, they could smell it. They could see the direct line from the blueprint to the brutality. But their superiors, back in Washington and at Pentagon planning tables, they couldn't smell anything. All they saw was the blueprint. All they saw was the future. And the future was a race. Because while our T-forces were digging crates out of mines in central Germany, the Soviet Red Army was doing the exact same thing in the East. Their version was called Operation Ostsowieckim. And they were not nearly as concerned with delicate questions of morality or paperwork. If a scientist hesitated, they had simpler methods. The competition for Nazi brains was on, and it was a free-for-all. So the pipeline starts to fill. First, it's documents. Then it's the scientists who explain the documents. Then it's their families. They're gathered at makeshift holding areas, comfortable villas, requisitioned hotels. They're given new clothes. They're fed. They're debriefed. They're being processed. But for what? They're still officially enemy aliens. Many are still ardent Nazis. The war isn't even over in the Pacific. A problem is developing. You can't just bring 100 Nazi scientists to America. There's public opinion. There are immigration laws. There are, theoretically, war crimes tribunals. You have a warehouse full of human beings who are both incredibly valuable and politically toxic. What do you do with them? You hide them, but not in a mine this time. You hide them in the one place nobody would think to look for a former SS officer, in plain sight. And to do that, you're going to need to rewrite some histories and burn a few more files, but that's the next part of the story. Coming up, how do you hide a Nazi in plain sight? You start by giving him a new name, a new past, and a very, very powerful friend. So the list is made, the data is crated up, the paper is burned, and the decision is made in that quiet, smoke-filled room to bring them over. But you don't just fly a bunch of German scientists with very recent, very problematic employment histories into New York Harbor with a brass band. You have to hide them, and not just from the public. You have to hide them from the other branches of the government, from Congress, from the press, from your own rule books. You have to make them disappear into the American landscape before anyone can ask the wrong question. This is where the operation gets surgical, and where the story gets, frankly, a little bureaucratic, because the magic wasn't in the daring raid or the secret handshake. The magic was in the paperwork, or rather, in the systematic absence of it. First, you change their names. Not all of them, but the big ones. The ones whose files were too thick with party membership, with SS affiliations, with things that even a desperate Army intelligence officer might raise an eyebrow at. You give them new identities, clean slates. Wernher von Braun's right-hand man, Arthur Rudolph, the operational director of the metalwork factory where thousands of slave laborers died. He became a new person. On paper, the man who signed off on daily production quotas signed, instead, a new life into existence. But a new name is just a label. You need a story. And the story they wrote was a masterpiece of omission. The standard immigration form, the one every refugee and displaced person filled out, had question 31. It asked, "Have you ever been a member of, or in any way connected or associated with, the Nazi Party or any of its affiliates?" A simple yes or no. For the Paperclip men, the answer was almost universally no. A lie typed neatly onto an official document, filed away in a system built on trust. They weren't just hiding Nazis. They were creating non-Nazis, with stamps and signatures. Now you might be thinking, surely someone checked. That's the thing. The system was designed so that nobody asterisk could asterisk check. The Army handled the initial screening in Europe. The State Department was supposed to approve the visas. The Justice Department was supposed to run background checks. But the Army, specifically the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, they were the gatekeepers. They controlled the files, and they began a very careful, very deliberate process of editing. They would receive the German scientists' original dossiers from the field. Thick folders filled with denazification tribunal reports, interviews, captured documents, and they would create new, cleaner versions. Incriminating phrases were removed. SS membership was downplayed or attributed to honorary status. Descriptions of their work were sanitized. The word slave never appeared. It was always labor. The factory was just a factory. The job was just a job. And here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't a rogue operation. It was policy. Once the JIOA had their cleaned-up versions, they would send them to the state and justice departments. But they'd attach a cover letter, a letter that essentially said, "We have vetted these men. They are clean. They are vital to national security. Any delay is a threat to America." It was a political chokehold. If a State Department clerk, buried in the bureaucracy, saw a red flag and tried to block a visa, they'd get a call, or their boss would get a call. The pressure came from the top. The message was clear: make it happen, don't ask why. So the scientists came over, but not to Washington, not to some gleaming laboratory where they might be seen. They went to the edges, to the places America forgets about. Fort Bliss, Texas. A sprawling Army base in the desert, right on the Mexican border. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. Vast, empty, fenced-off spaces where the sky was the only witness. They lived in barracks. Their families lived in quarters that were, by all accounts, comfortable but isolated. They were both guests and prisoners. They were being studied as much as they were studying. You have to picture this. These men who had been lords of Peenemünde with their villas and their authority were now living in American Army housing. They were given allowances. They shopped at the PX. Their kids went to the base school. They were, for all intents and purposes, a strange, sequestered colony of German engineers in the middle of the Southwest. And the American officers assigned to them, their job was twofold: keep them happy and keep them quiet. Make sure the work continues, and make sure no reporter from El Paso decides to take a drive and ask what all the Germans are doing out here. And the work did continue. They started where they left off. They began assembling V-2 rockets from parts shipped over in those same crates we talked about. They launched them from White Sands, the same rockets that had rained down on London and Antwerp, now painting arcane data across the New Mexico sky. The Army filmed these launches. The footage is eerie. You see the familiar cigar shape of the V-2, with its black and white checkered pattern, rising not over the Baltic coast, but over cactus and sagebrush. The past wasn't just being hidden. It was being repurposed in real time right in front of them. But you can't hide people forever, not completely. The lie was too big, and cracks started to appear, not in the desert but back in Washington. There were men in the State Department, in the Justice Department, who hadn't gotten the memo, or who had and decided they didn't like it. They started asking questions. They saw the visa applications with the obvious gaps. They read between the lines of the sanitized reports, and they began to write memos. Sharp, angry, principled memos about importing ardent Nazis. They called it a moral crisis. These memos went up the chain. They landed on the desks of people who had gotten the memo, and those people had a choice. They could investigate the allegations, or they could investigate the allegers. You can guess which path they chose. The men raising the alarm were sidelined. Their concerns were labeled as bureaucratic foot-dragging, as a failure to understand the new, pragmatic realities of the Cold War. The system wasn't just hiding the scientists, it was insulating itself, protecting the operation from its own conscience. So the colony in the desert kept working. The files stayed clean. The launches continued. And a very specific, very dangerous idea was being proven true. That if you wrap something in enough layers of classification and stamp it national security, you can make just about anything disappear, even a past, even a person. You can hide a Nazi in plain sight as long as you call him something else. A specialist. A consultant, an asset, but the desert was just the waiting room. The real plan was always bigger. They weren't brought here to live in barracks forever. They were meant to be integrated, to become American. And that required one final, audacious piece of paperwork. A policy so blunt, so purposefully blind, that it would erase the last remaining obstacle. It was the policy that would turn a hidden colony into a public success story. And it was called the No Bad People policy. So now we have the system. The lists are made. The lie is in place. The burning of the files has begun. The machinery is greased and ready to run. But here's the thing about machinery. It needs an operator. Someone has to stand at the controls, look at the raw material coming down the line, and decide what gets stamped approved and what gets tossed in the scrap heap. And that's where we meet the men who had to make those calls. Not the generals in Washington, not the spy masters drawing up the grand strategy. The men in the field. The intelligence officers sitting across a table from a man who just months before was building weapons meant to kill their friends. And they were given a policy, a directive, a way to square the circle. It didn't have a formal name, not on paper, but in practice, everyone knew what it was. Call it the No Bad People policy. The logic went like this. We want the brains. The brains are inside the men. The men did things or oversaw things or knew about things that are problematic. So you separate the man from his work. You separate the scientist from the political system he worked within. You perform a kind of intellectual surgery. You extract the knowledge, the skill, the genius, and you treat the rest. The party membership, the SS rank, the use of slave labor as an unfortunate but removable tumor. A byproduct of war. You don't see a asterisk Nazi asterisk. You see a asterisk rocket engineer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You'd think someone would have noticed the flaw in that, right? The man tasked with implementing this policy on the ground was a U.S. Army major named Robert B. Staver. He wasn't a politician. He was an engineer, a practical man. His job, handed down from higher up, was simple: find the rocket men, interview them, and figure out who was worth bringing over. He was the first filter. He sat in those rooms in the crumbling ruins of the Third Reich and had to ask himself, how do you measure a man's moral weight against the thrust of his rockets? The answer, it turned out, was that you often didn't. You measured his usefulness. Staver, to his credit, seemed to wrestle with it. In his reports, he'd note things. He'd write that a certain scientist was an ardent Nazi. He'd flag another as 100% Nazi, dangerous type. But these weren't deal breakers. They were footnotes. An asterisk on a resume. The question at the top of the form wasn't, is this a good man? It was, can this man help us? And here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't just about ignoring the past. It was about actively constructing a new past for them. The no bad people policy required a supporting cast of enablers. You needed people who would look at a dossier full of red flags and see only a blank slate. Enter a man named Dr. John H. Jack O'Mara. He was a psychologist for U.S. Army intelligence. His job was to profile these scientists, to vet them, to give a psychological stamp of approval. Now, stay with me here. What kind of psychological profile do you think you could possibly do in 1945? There's no time for months of analysis. The Russians are coming. You have a week, maybe two. You sit with a man who has every reason in the world to lie to you. His life, his family's life, his future, depends on him convincing you he's not the person in the Gestapo files. And O'Mara, according to the accounts that trickled out later, developed a theory, a convenient one. He reportedly began to argue that many of these top German scientists were not political Nazis. They were apolitical. They were men of pure science living in an ivory tower. The party membership, a formality. The SS rank, a requirement to keep their labs funded. They were, in his view, coerced. They were victims of the regime, too. Just victims with nice houses and well-funded research departments, and the power of life and death over the starving slaves in the tunnels of Mittelwerk. Nobody ever asked why an apolitical man would accept an honorary SS commission from Heinrich Himmler himself. That was a detail that got filed away, under O. So the process worked like this. Staver would identify the technical talent. O'Mara, or men like him, would provide the psychological cover story. They'd write things like not a threat, career-minded, devoted to family. And then the file would move up the chain, where the final layer of whitewash was applied. This was the denazification certificate. This was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. The occupying authorities had a process to officially clear Germans of Nazi ties. It was meant for the little people, the shopkeepers, the farmers, but the paperclip scientists got fast-tracked. A sympathetic officer would review their hand-picked, pre-written statements. They'd accept the story of the apolitical technician. And they'd stamp a document that said, officially, this man was clean. He had been denazified. It meant nothing. It was a piece of paper generated to satisfy a paper requirement. But it was the most important piece of paper they would ever get. It was the passport. It turned Arthur Rudolph, operations director of the Mittelwerk factory where 20,000 slaves died, into Arthur Rudolph, rocket propulsion expert. It turned Kurt Debus, an active SS officer who helped launch V-2s that killed civilians, into Kurt Debus, flight test director. The no bad people policy wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a triumph of willful ignorance. It was looking at a mountain of evidence and deciding the mountain wasn't there. Because the view from the top was just too valuable. And so they started to arrive. Not as prisoners, not as refugees, as consultants, as valued employees. They were given contracts, salaries. They were settled into communities. Fort Bliss, Texas, Dayton, Ohio. They brought their families, their furniture, their pasts neatly erased and replaced with fresh American futures. You have to picture the scene. It's 1946, 1947, an American town. A neighbor sees a new family moving in. The man has a faint accent. He's polite. He works up at the Army base on something technical. The kids are in school. They have a car. They're just another family on the block, part of the post-war boom. The American dream delivered straight from the heart of the nightmare. Nobody in the neighborhood knew. How could they? The files were clean. The policy had worked. The man next door mowing his lawn wasn't a bad person. The system had said so. It had written it down. And that was that. But the past has a way of not staying filed. It whispers. It leaves traces. And for one of these men, the carefully constructed story was about to fray at the edges, not because of a government investigation, but because of a simple, human letter in the mail, a letter that would introduce the world to the doctor who never was. So we've got the policy, the no bad people policy, a clean slate for a dirty past, and we've got the system. The new names, the new papers, the new histories, a machine for turning a man inside out. Now you'd think the machine would be reserved for the big fish, right? The Wernher von Brauns, the men whose faces were on wanted posters. But the machine had a hunger, and it was about to be fed a very different kind of passenger. This is where we meet the doctor. Or rather, the man who would become a doctor. Because in America, he wasn't one yet. His name was Hubertus Strughold. In Germany, during the war, he was a leading figure in aviation medicine. He ran the Luftwaffe S Institute for Aviation Medicine in Berlin. It was a prestigious post. Cutting-edge research. How to keep a pilot conscious at high altitude. How to protect him from the cold if he bails out over the North Sea. Vital work for a nation fighting a two-front war. And some of that work, some of it was conducted at a place called Dachau. Stay with me here. The link wasn't a secret, it was operational. The Luftwaffe needed data on human limits, and the SS, which ran the concentration camps, had a ready supply of test subjects who would not be missed. It was a bureaucratic partnership, a meeting of morbid minds. Strughold's institute designed experiments. Other, more directly SS-aligned doctors, like the notorious Sigmund Rascher, carried them out at Dachau. The experiments were monstrous. Prisoners locked in low-pressure chambers to simulate high altitude until their lungs ruptured. Others frozen in ice water to test hypothermia treatments. They died screaming, their agony meticulously recorded as data points. Now, the official line, the one Strughold would give for the rest of his life, was that he knew nothing. He was a pure scientist, head down in his Berlin lab, horrified when he later heard rumors. He condemned Rascher. He said the man was a criminal, a rogue operator. But here's the part that should bother you. Hubertus Strughold co-authored a medical paper in 1942, a detailed, scientific paper. Its title, translated, was Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter. And in that paper, he cited data, specific data on how long it takes for a human body to freeze to death in water. He cited it calmly as a scientific source. Where do you think that data came from? You don't get numbers like that from lab volunteers sipping tea. You get them from the ice water baths at Dachau. The paper is a stone-cold fact. It exists. He put his name on it, so at the very least the man knew the data. He used the data. He published the data. The question is, did he ever ask * how it was gathered? And if he did ask, what was the answer? Nobody in Paperclip asked. Or if they did, they didn't care. Because Strughold wasn't just any scientist. He was, in the eyes of the Army Air Force's officers running Paperclip's medical wing, the absolute prize. The world's foremost expert on how the human body reacts to the sky. And America wanted to go to the edge of space. Maybe beyond. So the machine whirred to life. Hubertus Strughold arrived in the United States in 1947. He was given a contract at the Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine, which was moving to a new state-of-the-art facility at Randolph Field in Texas. He was given a new life, a clean biography. The whispers about Dachau were filed away, deep in drawers in Washington, marked background, not for dissemination. In Texas, he became a different man, a respected professor. A fatherly figure to young American flight surgeons. He pioneered the study of what spaceflight would do to the human body. He coined the term space medicine. His work laid the foundation for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. He advised NASA. His textbooks were standard issue. He was, for all public purposes, the kind and brilliant Dr. Strughold. But the past has a way of bubbling up, not in a dramatic, public way, in quiet, bureaucratic ways. In 1952, the U.S. government was processing applications for citizenship for its Paperclip scientists. Strughold applied. The standard background check went to the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, and an OSI agent did his job. He dug. He found the 1942 paper. He found the links to Rasher. He wrote a memo, a blunt, damning memo. It stated that Strughold was, and I'm paraphrasing here, not just aware of the Dachau experiments, but was an active participant in that network. The agent recommended that Strughold's citizenship be denied, that he be deported. You'd think that would be it, right? A clear finding from a U.S. government investigator, a direct link to war crimes, but this is Paperclip. The policy was no bad people. It was no inconvenient asterisk people. The memo vanished. Or rather, it was overruled. Someone higher up, and we'll never know who scrawled the signature, looked at the same facts and saw not a war criminal but an asset, a necessary asset. The OSI's recommendation was ignored, stamped not approved, filed away in a different drawer. Hubertus Strughold became a U.S. citizen in 1956. He lived a long, celebrated life. Awards, honors, a library named after him at the Brooks Air Force Base. The father of space medicine. When journalists in the 1970s and 80s began asking uncomfortable questions about his past, the Air Force and NASA issued statements. They said investigations had cleared him. They said he was a man of great integrity. They pointed to his American career, his gentle demeanor. They said the allegations were unsubstantiated. But they never produced the OSI memo. They never explained the 1942 paper. They just asked the public to look at the distinguished doctor in Texas and to forget the man in the white coat who stood in the doorway in Berlin. So what do you have? You have a man whose scientific work, the very work America coveted, was fertilized by the suffering of the innocent. You have a government that knew it, documented it, and chose to look the other way because his mind was more valuable than his morality. They didn't just hire a Nazi. They hired a man who had trafficked in the worst data imaginable, and then they helped him build a legacy on top of it. He wasn't the only one, of course. The medical wing of Paperclip was its own special circle, but Strughold is the perfect, chilling example. He represents the final, complete success of the operation. It wasn't just about getting a scientist. It was about creating new asterisk scientist, an American one. with a past so thoroughly scrubbed, so professionally whitewashed that it ceased to exist. The doctor who never was, treating the astronauts who would soon be. And while he was settling into his office in Texas, learning to like iced tea and the wide Texas sky, other ships were docking. Not with rocket scientists, not with doctors, but with men whose expertise was written in a darker, quieter language. Men who understood the architecture of fear. Their landing would be even quieter, and their new jobs would be even closer to home. So the lists are made, the files are scrubbed. The new identities are typed up and waiting in a drawer somewhere. The policy is set, no bad people, and the war in Europe is over. Now you have to get them here. That's the part that always gets me. The quiet part, the logistical part. This wasn't a parade. There were no ticker tape welcomes in New York Harbor, no brass bands. You don't roll out the red carpet for a secret. You use a back door, a side entrance, a staircase nobody uses anymore. The first arrivals came in the summer of '45. They came under a program with a deliberately boring administrative name, Project Overcast. The idea was they'd be here temporarily, just for the summer, to help with questioning. Just until we'd picked their brains clean. That was the story. You'd bring them over, get what you need, and then, well, the then was always a little fuzzy. Send them back to a Germany in ruins. Hand them over to the people who wanted to put them on trial. That was the official line. But when you've already gone to the trouble of inventing a whole new person, you're not really planning a return trip, are you? They landed at airfields in New England, places like Westover Field in Massachusetts, and the first thing you have to understand is the sheer, mundane normalcy of it. This is the part nobody talks about, the anticlimax. Imagine the scene. A military airfield in America, July 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 2 months. The boys are starting to come home. The place is a hive of routine. Trucks moving, mechanics swearing over engines, the smell of asphalt and aviation fuel. And then a plane lands. Not a bomber coming back from the Pacific. A transport plane. It taxis to a quiet corner of the tarmac, away from the main hangars. The door opens, and out come men, just men, in suits that don't quite fit, carrying small suitcases. They look tired, they look nervous. They look like accountants who have had a very long flight, which in a way they were. These were the brains, the physicists, the chemists, the aerodynamicists, not soldiers, not in any traditional sense. They step onto American soil and they blink in the sunlight. There's no ceremony, no speeches. Just a couple of army officers with clipboards checking names against a list. Names that are, of course, not their own. You'd think someone would have noticed, right? A bunch of middle-aged German men with thick accents arriving on a military base in the middle of summer. But here's the thing about a bureaucracy at war's end. It's chaos. It's all movement. People coming, people going. New units forming, old ones disbanding. A few more civilians on base. Could be contractors. Could be State Department. Could be anything. You keep your head down, you do your job, you don't ask questions. That's how a secret walks in through the front door. They were processed quickly, given quarters. Often they were housed right on the base, in barracks or in isolated houses nearby. They were, officially, wards of the army. Their presence was not a secret from the people directly handling them, but it was compartmentalized. Need to know. The cook who brought them their meals knew they were Germans. The guard at the gate knew not to let them leave. But the town just down the road, they had no idea. And here's the part that should bother you. The timeline. The first group of these scientists, the ones from von Braun's team at Peenemünde, they landed in the United States in September 1945. Let me say that again. September 1945. The war with Japan ended in August 1945. VJ Day was September 2nd. So by the time these men were being settled into their new, temporary quarters in America, the Second World War was over. Done. The reason for their vital, urgent expertise to help us defeat the Nazis was gone. Poof, history. So why were they still coming? Because the goalposts had moved. The moment the war ended, a new one began. A quiet one. A cold one. And the target was no longer Berlin. It was Moscow. The temporary project, Overcast, became a permanent residency program by the spring of 1946. They gave it a new name. A name we've come to know, Paperclip. But before it had a name, it was just a thing that was happening. A quiet landing on a quiet tarmac. A man with a suitcase getting into an army car. A file folder with two names in it, the one on the front and the one typed on the papers inside. Think about that first night. You're one of these men. You've spent the last years in a desperate race, working under the threat of bombs and then the threat of the Russian advance. You've been interrogated by the British and the Americans. You've been whitewashed. You've been given a new name, a new past. And now you're in a small room on an American army base. The war is over. You're safe. Your family is somewhere. You are, for all intents and purposes, a ghost, a useful ghost. What do you think about? The work you did, the people who died building the things you designed, the future. Or do you just think about the next meal, the next assignment, the next step in simply surviving? The moral calculus gets very small, very personal in a barracks room at night. And while they're sitting in those rooms, the machinery is already turning for the next wave. The chemists, the doctors, the men who didn't work on rockets but on other things, more disturbing things. The ones who made the lists were already looking past the aeronautical engineers. They were looking for the men who understood nerve gases and pathogens and the limits of the human body under extreme conditions. The rocket scientists were the test case, the proof of concept. If we could asterisk them in, clean them up, and put them to work, then why stop there? The arrivals kept coming. By ship now, too, through ports like Boston and New York. They'd come in on military transports mixed in with returning GIs and war materiel. They'd disappear into the stream. A document from the time, an internal memo, said the goal was to handle them with minimum publicity and maximum security. Not maximum scrutiny. Not maximum oversight. Maximum security. Security from whom? From the public. From the press. From the other allies who'd been promised a share of the scientific spoils. They were dispersed. Some went to Maryland, some to Texas, some to Ohio. They were put to work immediately because that was the whole point. At places like Fort Bliss in Texas and the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the rocket men started reassembling their work from memory and from the crates of parts that had been shipped over. They were building again. Only this time, the flag behind them was different. And nobody introduced them to their new colleagues. Nobody said, "This is Hans, he helped design the V2 that killed thousands in London." They were just the new engineers, the German team, the ones with the accents. Don't mind them. They're here to help. So now they're here, on the ground, working. The deal is struck. But a deal with a ghost is a fragile thing. It relies on the ghost staying quiet, on the past staying buried, and it relies on everyone around them playing along with the new story, which leads us to the next perfectly logical, perfectly surreal step. The part where an entire American military and scientific establishment had to look at a man who spoke broken English with a thick German accent and pretend, just for the sake of convenience, that they didn't all speak the same language. Because coming up next is the part where everyone pretended not to speak German. So they're here now, in America. A few hundred men, their families, their files, their new identities. They've been processed through the intelligence gauntlet, their pasts scrubbed or softened, their futures waiting in places with names like Fort Bliss, Texas, and Wright Field, Ohio. The deal is done. The paperwork is filed. The secret is kept. But here's the part nobody talks about. The part that comes right after the secret is established. The part where everyone has to live with it. You have to picture the scene. It's the late 1940s. The war is over. The GIs are home. The country is trying to forget the horror, the sacrifice, the sheer scale of it all. And in military bases and research facilities across the country, there are now hundreds of German men with thick accents working on America's most sensitive projects. Rockets, jets, chemical weapons, mind control experiments. The very edge of what was possible. And everyone just pretended not to notice. I don't mean the public. The public was told nothing. I mean the American officers, the engineers, the guards, the secretaries, the people who worked alongside these men every single day. They had to perform this quiet, collective act of not seeing, a kind of bureaucratic amnesia. You'd walk into a lab at Wright Field. You'd hear German being spoken, not just technical terms, but casual conversation, jokes, arguments about soccer. You'd see a man who, just a year or two earlier, might have worn a uniform with an eagle clutching a swastika. Now he's wearing a lab coat with a U.S. Army Air Forces patch. And the rule, unspoken but absolute, was, you don't ask. You don't ask where he came from. You don't ask what he did during the war. You don't ask how he got here. The official line, if anyone was brazen enough to question it, was that these were specialists. Technical consultants. They were here to help us understand the German technical mind. It was all about the science. The science was pure. The science had no politics, but of course it did. Every blueprint, every equation, every test result they brought with them was stained. It was built on a mountain of slave labor, on the bones of thousands who died in the tunnels of middlework. That knowledge didn't float into their heads. It was extracted at a cost so monstrous we still can't fully comprehend it. And yet, in those American labs and barracks, that cost was the ghost in the room, the thing everyone agreed to ignore. So how did it work? How do you get an entire organization to play along with a fiction this large? It started with language, a deliberate fog. Memos and orders referred to the Germans as the Foreign Scientist Group or the Special Employees. Their contracts were handled through a shadowy web of intelligence cutouts, not regular army procurement. Their pay was often higher than the American GIs guarding them, which caused its own quiet resentments. But again, you didn't ask. And then there were the minders. Each group of Germans had American officers assigned to them, part translator, part handler, part warden. Their job was to keep the scientists productive and to keep them isolated, to manage the fiction. One of these minders, an officer named Major James Hamel, was put in charge of Wernher von Braun's team at Fort Bliss. Hamel was a good soldier. He followed orders. He made sure the rockets got built. But in his private letters, later unearthed by historians, you can see the cognitive dissonance. He writes about taking von Braun and his inner circle on trips into El Paso for dinner. He describes them as brilliant, charming, even fun. He also notes in passing that they never, ever talked about the war, not a word. It was a wall, a silent agreement. We will work on the future, and we will never, ever speak of the past. You have to wonder what that dinner conversation was like. The American officer, who likely fought in the war, breaking bread with the men who built the V-2s that rained down on London and Antwerp, talking about the weather, talking about baseball. The weight of what was not being said must have been crushing. And here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't just an awkward silence. It was a policy, a calculated strategic forgetting. The Army and the CIA actively discouraged any investigation into the scientists' backgrounds. If a journalist got too close, they were fed a bland, positive story about scientific exchange. If an immigration official raised a flag, the file would mysteriously vanish to a higher authority. The goal was to normalize their presence as quickly as possible. They even started producing their own propaganda. Newsreels were filmed at White Sands Proving Ground, showing the German scientists, now billed as our scientists, helping to launch captured V-2s for atmospheric research. The narration was upbeat, forward-looking. The cameras focused on the soaring rockets, not the faces of the men who had built the same machines to kill civilians. The message was clear. Look at the technology, not the technologists. But within the compounds, the old world didn't just vanish. The German scientists largely kept to themselves. They formed their own little enclaves. They celebrated German holidays. They taught their children in German schools they set up on base. For them, it wasn't America yet. It was a continuation of their work under new management, a kind of scientific exile, and the Americans assigned to work with them had to navigate this weird, dual reality. You're told this man is a vital asset to national security. You're also aware on some level of what he represents, so you compartmentalize, you focus on the task, you learn to laugh at his jokes, you call him by his new, clean name, you pretend you don't hear the German in the hallway. Nobody ever asked why we had to be the ones to do this, why the price of their knowledge was our silence. The question was treated as naive, unserious. This was the Cold War. The Soviets were doing the same thing we told ourselves. It was a race. And in a race, you don't stop to check the moral credentials of your mechanics. But this pretense, this collective agreement to look the other way, had consequences. It created a culture. A culture where the origin of something, whether it was a rocket design or a medical experiment, mattered less than its utility. Where denazification became a paperwork exercise, not a moral one. A rubber stamp on a file, not a scrutiny of a soul. It taught a generation of American intelligence officers and military planners that some secrets are so important, they justify building your house on a rotten foundation. You just don't talk about the smell. And for the scientists themselves, what lesson did they learn? That their work was their passport, that their past was negotiable, that the world was divided not into right and wrong, but into those who had the winning technology and those who did not. They saw their American colleagues play along with the charade, and they understood the transaction perfectly. So the work continued. The rockets got bigger. The projects got more ambitious. And with every successful test, the pretense hardened into fact. These weren't former Nazis anymore. They were our guys, our brain trust. Until, of course, they started to build things. Not just modifications of their old German designs, but new things. American things. Or so we were meant to believe. Because the next logical question, once you've accepted these men and buried their histories, is a simple one. What are they actually building for us? And is it really asterisk for us? The answer would take shape not on a dusty Texas range, but in a top-secret desert complex that would become the heart of the American space program. A place where the past was officially dead and the future was a weapon. And that's where the story turns. Because the rocket that would soon rise from that desert, the one that would be hailed as a triumph of American engineering, it wasn't really ours. And the men in charge knew it. So they're here, the men from the list. They've been scrubbed, given new papers, and settled into places where nobody asks too many questions. Fort Bliss, Texas, Wright Field in Ohio, the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They're on the payroll. They have security clearances. The deal is done. But a deal for what exactly? You remember the first lie. We don't want the scientists, we want the data. That's what they told the State Department, the press, anyone who might ask. The data was the prize. The men were just translators, a necessary evil to unlock the technical treasure. But here's where it gets weird. The data, the tons of documents, the crates of blueprints hauled across the Atlantic, it was all in German. Every schematic, every equation, every test report. It was the language of the V2. And the only people who truly spoke that language, who could read between the lines of those schematics, who understood why this valve failed at that pressure or why that gyroscope drifted in the cold, were the men who designed it. The men who were now on the payroll. So the lie inverted itself. They didn't bring the scientists to read the data. They brought the data to give the scientists something to do, to make their employment look like a paperwork project, not a brain transplant. And that brings us to the rocket, the first big, public, undeniable thing, the thing that would make the lie permanent. The Army had a problem. The Soviet Union had a rocket program, too. They de-grabbed their own Germans from Mittelwerk. The Cold War wasn't even cold yet. It was still steaming from the heat of the last war. And the Pentagon wanted a missile, a long-range missile, something that could carry a new kind of warhead a very long way. They had the V2. Hundreds of them captured, shipped in pieces to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. They called them assembled component rounds. A nice, sterile phrase. They weren't Nazi weapons anymore. They were laboratory specimens. And who do you think was put in charge of making them fly? Wernher von Braun, the man who made the list. He and his team were installed at Fort Bliss, just over the Texas border from White Sands. Their job was to help the American Army fire the V2, to study it, to learn from it. But think about that for a second. You've got the original architect. You give him his original creation. You ask him to make it work. What do you think is going to happen? He's not going to just help. He's going to take over. He's going to improve. And that's exactly what happened. The first V2 launched from American soil went up on April 16, 1946. It was a test, a basic flight. The Army called it a success. But it was a German rocket launched by German engineers on American soil. The paint was different. The uniforms of the men pushing the buttons were different, but the brain behind it, the same. This is the pivot. This is the moment the operation stopped being about the past war and became about the next one. Every successful launch was a justification. See, we need them. Look what they can do. The Army started to lean on von Braun and his team not as consultants, but as the core of their own missile program. They began designing new rockets, not just reassembling V2s, but building on them. The Corporal, the Redstone, these were American rockets, funded by American taxpayers. Built in American factories, but their lineage was pure Peenemünde. The shape, the propulsion, the guidance concepts, it was all there. The rocket that wasn't ours had, in a very real sense, become the foundation for the rocket that was. And nobody talked about the foundation. The public saw newsreels of spectacular launches in the New Mexico desert. They heard about American ingenuity reaching for the skies. They did not hear about the quiet conversations in German that happened in the blockhouses before countdown. They didn't see the internal memos where von Braun's team argued for their own designs over those of native-born American engineers, and won. You'd think someone would have asked. A journalist. A congressman. Hey, These new rockets look an awful lot like the ones that were blowing up London. And don't we have some guys from that program working for us? Is there a connection? But the connection was the whole point. It was the secret. To admit the connection was to admit the lie. So the public story became one of seamless technological progress. We captured the hardware, we learned its secrets, and we moved on. The men were erased from the equation. But here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't just about building bigger missiles for the army. That was the day job, the cover story. The thing that kept the funding flowing and the security officers happy. Von Braun had a different dream. He always had. He didn't just want to build weapons. He wanted to go to space. The moon, Mars. He'd dreamed of it since he was a teenager reading science fiction. The V2, for him, was just a first step. A violent, terrible, necessary first step to prove the technology could work. And now he was in America, with a blank check from the U.S. Army, with a team of his most brilliant colleagues, with nobody looking over his shoulder except officers who wanted a missile that could hit Moscow. So he played the game. He gave the army what it wanted. He worked on the weapons, but he started talking, carefully, strategically. He gave speeches. He wrote articles. He collaborated with Walt Disney on television specials about the future of space travel. He became the friendly, charismatic face of the American space program before it even existed. The man who built the weapon that terrorized London was rebranding himself as a visionary, a prophet of the space age, and America bought it. We loved the show. The spectacular launches, the artists' renderings of space stations, the promise of adventure. We never stopped to ask what the price of that vision was. We never asked what we had agreed to in those quiet rooms in 1945 when we decided the ends justified the means. We got the rocket, but the rocket was never just a machine. It was a vessel, and it carried more than just a payload into the sky. It carried the entire weight of the bargain. The public saw the future, the army saw a weapon, and von Braun, he saw a path off the planet, a path that began in the ruins of a conquered country and wound its way through the deserts of the American Southwest. But while everyone was looking up at the rockets, at the promise and the threat they carried, almost nobody was looking at what else the men from the list were doing. The weapons were one thing, the space dreams were another, but there was a third track, a quieter one. One that didn't involve explosions or orbit. It happened in laboratories, not launch pads, and it involved a different kind of science altogether. A science that didn't deal with trajectories and thrust, but with the human body and the human mind. And that is where the story takes a much darker turn. Because the rocket that wasn't ours was only the beginning of what we brought home. So the rockets are flying. The V2s are now Redstones. The Germans are now Americans. And the public story is that we've won the space race before it's even started. We've got the best minds, and we're putting them to work for freedom. That's the picture they were painting. But here's the part nobody talks about. The rockets were the cover story. The shiny, noisy, spectacular thing you were supposed to look at. The thing that could be photographed on a launch pad, that could be shown to Congress, that could be used to promise a future of American dominance in the sky. It was the perfect distraction. Because while Wernher von Braun and his team were building missiles for the army in Huntsville, Alabama, another group of paperclip imports was being put to work somewhere else, on something else. And what they were working on, it didn't look like the future. It didn't look like progress. It looked like something out of a nightmare they just finished fighting a war to stop. You see, the list that Major Staver and his colleagues put together back in those chaotic final days of the war, it wasn't just rocket scientists. That was the biggest category, sure, the most famous, but it was a shopping list. And the U.S. military had many, many departments with many, many needs. The Army Chemical Corps had needs. The Air Force had needs. The Navy's Bioweapons Research Unit had needs. And all of them looked at the ruins of the Third Reich and saw not a crime scene, but a laboratory. A laboratory that had conducted experiments you could never, ever propose in a democratic society. Experiments with limits, ethical limits, moral limits, human limits, that had been completely erased. So they brought over the men who ran that lab. We're not talking about engineers who worked with metals and fuels. We're talking about medical doctors, physiologists, toxicologists, aeronautical specialists. These were the men who had worked at places like Dachau, who had studied how the human body breaks down at high altitude, who had tested new vaccines and chemical agents on prisoners, who had spent years asking questions science had agreed never to ask because the only way to get the answers was to kill people. And now they were on the payroll. The justification, if you can call it that, was always the same. The Soviets have this data. We have to have it too. If we don't, we're vulnerable. It was the same cold, transactional logic that justified the rockets, but this was different. This wasn't about physics. This was about the human body, about pain, about how much a mind can take before it shatters. So what did they do with these men? They put them in white coats again. They gave them security clearances. They set them up at places like Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, at a secret Air Force facility called, and you'll appreciate the dark poetry of this, the Aeromedical Laboratory. Their new assignments, officially it was research, studying the effects of high-altitude flight, the limits of human endurance, developing protections for American pilots. All noble goals, right? All in the name of national defense. But you have to ask yourself a question. If you're an American officer in 1947, and you want to know how a pilot's body reacts to sudden decompression at 60,000 feet, who are you going to ask? Some bright young doctor from Johns Hopkins who's never seen it happen. Or the German scientist who literally wrote the book on it. A book based on watching live human subjects die in a vacuum chamber. You go to the expert. And the expert was Dr. Hubertus Strughold. They called him the father of space medicine. He had a whole institute named after him, decades later. He also ran the Luftwaffe's Aeromedical Institute during the war, an institute that used data from those deadly Dachau experiments. He came over in Paperclip. Or you want to know about nerve gases, how they disperse, how they kill, what the exact symptoms are second by second. You don't hire a chemist from DuPont. You hire Dr. Kurt Blome, the deputy Reich health officer, the man Hitler personally put in charge of the Nazi plague weapon program. A man who was tried at Nuremberg for conducting experiments on prisoners with bubonic plague. He was acquitted. Lack of evidence. The Americans quietly hired him in 1951 to work on their own biological weapons program. He worked for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps for *5 years. Think about that for a second. The man who was on trial for crimes against humanity for weaponizing plague is acquitted, and a few years later he's in Maryland advising the United States on how to weaponize diseases. You'd think someone would have noticed, right? Some reporter, some congressman, but nobody asked, because the work was all classified, and the men doing it were hidden behind new names, new biographies, new identities. They were Nazi doctors. They were foreign consultants. Technical experts. And here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't just about Asterisk reviewing the old German data. That was the first lie they told themselves. We just want the files. Then it became, we need the men who understand the files. And then inevitably it became, we need these men to continue their work. Because the data was incomplete. The Nazi experiments were monstrous, but they were also sloppy, unscientific, done by sadists, not rigorous researchers. So the new projects, the American projects, had to be more controlled, more precise, which is how you get the CIA in the early 1950s launching a program called MK Ultra, a program to find ways to control the human mind, to break a person and rebuild them, to induce amnesia, to create perfect, programmable assets. And where do you think they started? Where do you think they looked for a baseline? They looked at the work of Dr. Walter Schreiber, another Paperclip import. The former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, a man who oversaw medical experiments on prisoners. He was brought to the U.S., to the Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine. He lectured American officers on stress, on interrogation resistance. The circle just closes, tight and silent. So while you were looking at the rockets, while the newspapers were printing pictures of von Braun pointing at a chalkboard with a big, friendly smile, this other work was going on in the basement labs and the sealed-off wings of military bases. It was the dark twin of the space program. Instead of asking, how do we keep a man alive in space? They were asking, how much can a man endure before he ceases to be a man? And the men asking the questions were the same ones who'd been asking them before. Only now they had better funding, better facilities, and the full, protected backing of the United States government. The rockets were the promise. This was the price. A secret, institutionalized corruption, not just of our morals, but of our very science. We didn't just hire their brains, we hired their conscience. Or rather, we hired their lack of one. And then we put it to work. If you're the kind of person who likes knowing what really happened, subscribe. We dig into a new American mystery every single night. And for these men, the doctors, the transition to American life required one more thing. A very specific, very convenient mental skill. One that would become their greatest asset in their new home. Coming up next, a very convenient case of amnesia. You'll learn how the past wasn't just buried, it was erased. So you have these men. They're here. They're working. They're building rockets that are, on paper, for the exploration of space. And everyone is playing along. The army is happy. The scientists are, if not happy, then at least comfortable. The public is told a story about brilliant pioneers and they buy it. The machine is running smoothly. But there's a gear in this machine that doesn't quite fit. A question that won't go away, no matter how much official paperwork you stack on top of it. What did these men do? Not in the abstract. Not they worked for the Nazi regime. What did they, as individuals, do? Did they just sit in a room and solve math problems while the world burned outside? Or did they get their hands dirty? And if they did, how dirty? This is where the story gets very, very quiet, because suddenly nobody can remember anything. The army had a process, of course. They called it denazification. It was a series of interviews, questionnaires, background checks. The idea was to sort the merely opportunistic from the true believers, the technicians from the war criminals. It was a good idea, on paper. But here's the part that should bother you. The men conducting these interviews for the U.S. Army weren't detectives or prosecutors. They were, more often than not, fellow scientists and engineers. Their job wasn't to dig for guilt. Their job was to get these new colleagues cleared for work as fast as possible. You see the conflict of interest, right? So the interviews became a kind of theater, a ritual where everyone knew their lines. The scientist would sit down. He would be polite, contrite. He would say he was only interested in the science. He was apolitical. He was forced. He never saw anything. He heard rumors, of course, terrible rumors, but he was in his laboratory, his head in the equations. He didn't know about the camps. He certainly didn't know that the factory building his rocket parts was using slave labor from a concentration camp just a few miles down the road. How could he know? He was a thinker, not a manager. And the American officer across the table would nod. He would write something down. He might ask, "And your membership in the SS? This file says you were given an honorary rank." A dismissive wave of the hand, a bureaucratic necessity, a meaningless title given to all department heads to smooth logistics. It meant nothing. He never wore the uniform. He never attended a meeting. The officer would look at the file, then at the man. He would see a brilliant mind, a man who could help America reach the moon. He would see a man who was now ostensibly on his asterisk team. And he would see a mountain of paperwork and headache if he pressed the issue. So he'd close the file. He'd stamp it. Cleared. It happened over and over. A very convenient case of amnesia spreading like a virus. The Germans couldn't remember their crimes, and the Americans couldn't remember to ask the hard questions. But you can't bury everything. Sometimes the past has a way of scratching at the floorboards. Take Arthur Rudolph. He was one of Wernher von Braun's top men, a project manager for the V-2 rocket, a real get for the Americans. He was brought over, he worked at Fort Bliss, he became a naturalized U.S. citizen, and he was brilliant. He later became the manager of the Saturn V rocket program at NASA, the very rockets that took Americans to the moon. An American success story. But in the winter of 1943, Arthur Rudolph wasn't in Texas. He was in Mittelwerk. Mittelwerk was the underground hell where the V-2 rockets were built. The factory was dug into a mountain. It was damp, cold, lit by flickering bulbs, and it was staffed by slaves, prisoners from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. They were worked until they collapsed. They were beaten. They were starved. They died by the thousands, their bodies piled in carts and later cremated. Arthur Rudolph was the Asterisk Operations Director Asterisk. His signature is on memos. His job was production quotas. More rockets, faster. When the slave laborers, sick, starving, exhausted, couldn't meet the quotas, who do you think was notified? When there was a bottleneck in the supply of gyroscopes or fuel lines, who do you think demanded it be fixed? This isn't speculation. The documents existed. U.S. investigators would find them later. They detailed meetings Rudolph attended, orders he gave. They showed a man deeply, operationally involved in a system of murder through labor. So what did he tell his American denazification panel? He said he was an engineer. He said he was responsible for technical problems, not people. He said the SS handled the workforce. He said he found the conditions regrettable. That was the word, regrettable. And the American officer, looking at the man who could build intercontinental missiles for him, chose to believe it. Rudolph was cleared. His amnesia was accepted as fact. But stay with me here, because it gets weirder. This wasn't just about looking the other way. This was about active, willful reconstruction. The army needed these men to be clean, so they started to make them clean. They didn't just accept the stories, they helped write them. Files began to change. Incriminating paragraphs disappeared. Dates were altered. Membership in Nazi organizations was downgraded from active participant to nominal member, then to no record found. Witnesses who might say something unpleasant, they were unavailable, or their testimony was deemed unreliable. They weren't just hiding Nazis. They were inventing new men, Men with pasts that were blank where they needed to be blank and shiny where they needed to be shiny. They were crafting official biographies, and these biographies became the truth. Anyone looking later would find the sanitized version, stamped and approved by the U.S. government itself. So you have to ask, at what point does accepting a lie become telling a lie? The Army had crossed that line. They were no longer just exploiting a convenient ignorance. They were the curators of that ignorance. They were the archivists of amnesia, and this created a dangerous precedent, a template. If you could make Arthur Rudolph's past disappear, why not the others? The chemists who worked on nerve gases, the doctors who conducted experiments, the intelligence officers who ran networks of spies and informants. The door was open. And it wasn't just rocket scientists walking through it anymore. Because while everyone was watching the men who pointed at the stars, a different group of paperclip imports was getting settled. Men whose work didn't end with a fiery launch into the sky. Their work was quieter, more intimate. It happened in laboratories, in clinics, in interrogation rooms. And their amnesia was the most profound of all. We'll get to them. But first, you need to see how the system protected its own. How a file didn't just get lost, but was made to disappear. So by the summer of 1947, the machine was humming. The men were here. Their files were scrubbed. Their pasts were, officially, a blank slate. They were working. And everyone who needed to look the other way was doing just that. The deal was done. But a deal like this, it leaves a paper trail. Or it's supposed to. You can't just bring over 1,000 people, give them security clearances, and pay them with government money without some kind of record. The Army had files. The State Department had files. The new Central Intelligence Agency, just getting its legs under it, was starting to collect files. And in those files were names, real names, and histories, real histories. The kind of histories that, if they ever saw the light of day, would blow the whole operation sky high. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. The bureaucracy of forgetting. Because you have to understand the mindset. This wasn't a one-time lie. It was an ongoing administrative process. Every time a scientist needed a new security badge, every time a requisition form was signed, every time a paycheck was cut, the lie had to be maintained. The system itself had to be complicit. And systems have a way of creating their own truth. The official record, once it's typed up and filed, becomes asterisk the reality. The messy, inconvenient past, that's just loose paper. And loose paper has a habit of getting lost. Which brings us to a man named Samuel Klaus. He wasn't a soldier. He was a lawyer for the State Department. And his job, specifically, was to vet visa applications for security risks. He was a stickler. A by-the-book guy in an operation that had thrown the book out the window. And he'd been a thorn in the side of Paperclip from the very beginning, writing furious memos about the obvious Nazi backgrounds of these scientists, pointing out the blatant violations of President Truman's own directives. His memos were ignored. His protests were overruled, but he kept copies. He filed them. And then, one day in 1947, he was told to hand over his entire file on Operation Paperclip. All of it. Every memo, every note, every damning piece of correspondence. He was told it was for a routine review. He was a good bureaucrat. He complied. The file left his office, and it vanished. It didn't get misfiled. It wasn't sitting in another department. It was gone, erased from the logs. When Klaus or anyone else went looking for it later, there was no record it had ever been received. No chain of custody. It had simply walked out of his office and into a memory hole. You'd think someone would have made a fuss, right? A top-level State Department file on one of the most sensitive operations in the country just disappears. But here's the part that should bother you. Nobody did. Or at least nobody who mattered. The people who wanted the file gone had it. The people who might have asked where it went were the same people who had ordered its removal. It was a perfect closed loop. This wasn't an accident. This was policy. A quiet, unspoken policy of selective amnesia enforced by the filing cabinet. If a document causes a problem, the document ceases to exist. The story goes that this practice came from the very top of the intelligence world. The goal was to create what they called a firewall, a gap in the record so clean, so absolute that later investigators, congressional committees, journalists, historians would hit a brick wall. They'd find the sanitized versions, the official biographies, the happy stories about the rocket men. But the raw, ugly, connecting tissue. The memos that said, in plain English, "We know he was a dedicated Nazi, but we need him anyway." Gone. And it worked. For decades. Historians would later piece together the story of Paperclip, but they'd always run into these phantom files, these reference documents that nobody could ever produce. They'd find a footnote citing a memo from Samuel Klaus, but the memo itself was nowhere to be found in the National Archives. It was like trying to reconstruct a shadow. But the most telling disappearance wasn't a file full of paper. It was a person. His name was Dr. Hubertus Strughold. You've heard of him even if you don't recognize the name. They called him the father of space medicine, a brilliant researcher. He had a whole Air Force laboratory named after him. His work was foundational for putting astronauts into space. His official biography: he was a gentle scientist who stayed in Germany during the war to continue his pure research on high-altitude physiology. A noble man. That was the story. Here's the other one. Strughold wasn't just in Germany. He was the director of the Luftwaffe S Institute for Aviation Medicine in Berlin, a high-ranking Nazi official. And his institute did research on prisoners from Dachau. The SS would deliver frozen, starving, dying men from the concentration camp to Strughold's colleagues. They'd be put into low-pressure chambers that simulated the freezing, thin air of high altitude. The doctors would take notes as their subjects' lungs ruptured, as they froze to death, as they died in agony, all in the name of science. All to help German pilots. The reports from these experiments existed, detailed, clinical, horrifying reports. And when the war ended, those reports were some of the most sought-after prizes for Allied intelligence, not to prosecute the doctors, to use the data. Strughold himself was brought over under Paperclip. His past was whitewashed. He became an American hero. Now, stay with me here. This is where the missing file becomes something darker. In the late 1940s, as the Paperclip scientists were being settled, a U.S. military intelligence officer was tasked with translating and analyzing those very Dachau hypothermia reports. He was a doctor himself, and what he read sickened him. He completed his translation, wrote a cover memo stating the data was scientifically useless, tainted by the monstrous conditions of its gathering, and filed it. He recommended the data be buried, never used. That officer's report, that translation, that moral condemnation, it vanished. Just like Samuel Klaus's file, gone from the archives. When researchers went looking for it decades later, all they found was a catalog entry. The document itself had been removed. Someone, somewhere, decided that the record of that objection could not be allowed to exist, because the data was being used. Quietly, discreetly, referenced in American research papers for years. The firewall had to protect not just the men, but the fruits of their work. So you have to ask yourself, When a file goes missing, who benefits? When a single dissenting voice is erased from the record, what does that tell you about the truth? It tells you the truth was dangerous. It tells you the story they were building was fragile. It tells you that the real operation wasn't just about bringing Nazis to America. It was about building a new history for them, brick by brick, while burning the blueprints of the old one. And for a long, long time, it worked. The firewall held. The public saw the rockets, read the headlines about our space heroes, and never asked where they came from. But firewalls have cracks. And paper, even burned paper, leaves a stain. Because while the government was busy making files disappear, there was another institution that loved finding them. An institution with printing presses and a deadline. The firewall was about to meet the free press. And someone was about to ask a question they weren't supposed to ask. So the scientists are here. They've been scrubbed. Their files are missing. They're working. The public story is that they're just a bunch of brilliant, apolitical engineers we scooped up for the good of the nation. And for a while, it works. It works because nobody's really looking. The war's over. People are building houses, having babies, buying televisions. The last thing anyone wants to think about is more Nazis. But you can't hide 160 men forever, not when they start winning awards. Not when the rockets they build start appearing on launch pads. The story was always a house of cards. And in the summer of 1946, a stiff breeze started blowing. That breeze had a name: Drew Pearson. He was a muckraking newspaper columnist with a national radio show. The kind of guy who made a living digging up what people in power wanted buried. And he had a source. A good one. Someone inside the State Department who was getting queasy about the sheer number of former enemy aliens suddenly drawing government paychecks. Pearson didn't get the whole picture. He didn't know it was called Paperclip, but he knew something was wrong. He started asking questions, and in August of '46, he went on the air and told his millions of listeners that the U.S. Army was, in his words, hiring Nazis. The reaction inside the Pentagon and the State Department wasn't panic. Not yet. It was more like annoyance. A buzzing fly that needed swatting. They issued the usual denials. Distinguished scientists, valuable technical knowledge, no evidence of war crimes. The standard script. They figured that would be the end of it, but Pearson kept digging. And this is where it gets interesting, because he wasn't just some loudmouth. He was methodical. He got names. He got locations. He found out about the camp at Fort Bliss, Texas, where Wernher von Braun and his team were living in relative comfort, working on rockets. He learned about the other groups scattered around the country, and he started connecting dots to the war itself, to the V2, to the factory at Middlework built by slaves. Now you have to understand the atmosphere. This was 1946. The Nuremberg trials were still going on. Newspapers were filled with stories about the camps, the atrocities. The phrase, "never again," wasn't just a slogan. It was a raw, fresh conviction. And here comes Drew Pearson saying, essentially, "Never mind all that, we've brought the architects of that terror over for tea." The public pressure started to build. Not a tsunami, but a steady, uncomfortable tide. Congressmen started getting letters. The State Department, which had always been the most reluctant partner in Paperclip, saw an opening. They had legal grounds to deny visas to these men. The official U.S. policy was to exclude Nazis, so they began to push back. They demanded the Army actually investigate these scientists, really investigate them. And the Army had to pretend to comply, so they created a new layer of the fiction. They appointed an investigator, a man named Samuel Klaus. Klaus was a State Department lawyer, and he was a true believer in the rules. He took the job seriously. He started reading the files that hadn't been lost. He interviewed the scientists, and he was horrified. He wrote memo after memo. He compiled dossiers. He pointed out that men like Arthur Rudolph, the production manager for the V2, had been members of the Nazi Party asterisk. Not just members, but often joined early, when it was still a choice, not a requirement for keeping your job. He found evidence of the conditions at Mittelwerk. He argued, forcefully, that bringing these men in violated not just American law, but American principle. Klaus became the internal whistleblower, the conscience the operation didn't want. He would send his damning reports up the chain, and they would vanish into a bureaucratic void. He'd get meetings where officers would shrug and say the intelligence value outweighed the moral considerations. That was the phrase they used. Moral considerations, as if it was a minor accounting error. But Klaus didn't let up. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like he might actually win. The press was sniffing around. Pearson was broadcasting weekly updates. The State Department was using Klaus's findings to block visa applications. Paperclip stalled. The scientists were in a kind of limbo, their futures uncertain. This was the crisis point. The whole operation was exposed, not to the public in full detail, but to the right people in the right rooms. The press had the scent. A government lawyer had the proof. All it would take was one congressional hearing, one determined reporter getting a full copy of a Klaus memo, and the house of cards would have collapsed. So why didn't it? Because the people running Paperclip had a trump card, and it wasn't a better argument. It was a new enemy. While Drew Pearson was talking about Nazis on the radio, the Soviet Union was consolidating its grip on Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain was falling, and in Washington, a new kind of fear was replacing the old one. The fear of communism, the fear of falling behind. The Army and the intelligence chiefs went to the State Department and the president's advisors with a simple, brutal calculus. They said, "Fine, let's follow the rules. Let's send von Braun and his team back to Germany. But when we do, the Soviets will be waiting for them. They will offer them a lab, a house, whatever they want. And in 6 months, they will be building rockets for Stalin. Rockets aimed at New York and London. Is that the moral high ground you want?" It was a master stroke. It reframed the entire debate. It was no longer a question of justice for the past. It was a question of survival in the future. The moral considerations Samuel Klaus talked about suddenly seemed like a luxury, a dangerous luxury. The State Department's resistance crumbled. Visas that had been blocked were suddenly approved with a wink and a nod. Security concerns overrode everything. The press. Drew Pearson was still shouting, but now he sounded like he was shouting about yesterday's problem. The public's attention had shifted to the Berlin airlift, to the Red Scare beginning to simmer at home. The Nazis in our midst became, once again, an inconvenient secret you kept for the greater good. Samuel Klaus was sidelined. His memos were filed away in a drawer labeled "Obstacles Overcome." The press moved on to other stories. The moment had passed. The system had absorbed the shock, acknowledged the truth, and then decided to ignore it. And here's the part that should bother you. It wasn't a cover-up in the dark. It was a decision made in the light. They saw the evidence. They heard the criticism. They knew exactly who these men were and what they had done, and they chose to proceed anyway. They didn't hide from the truth. They looked it in the eye and calculated that it was worth the cost. The scientists got the message. The debate was over. They were here to stay. Their past was officially irrelevant, and with that security, they could finally put down roots. They could stop being hidden guests and start becoming neighbors. They brought their families over. They bought houses. They joined community groups. Which leads us to the next, and perhaps most unsettling, chapter of the story. Because what happens when the secret weapons designers, the men with the shadows, try to live a normal American life? What happens in a place like Huntsville, Alabama, when it suddenly becomes the rocket capital of the world, built by a group of men who all share the same unspoken history? That's where we're going next. To the company picnics, the church socials, and the quiet streets of a southern town that had no idea who its new neighbors really were. So the files were clean. The press had been managed. The amnesia was convenient and complete. The men were here. Now they had to go to work, and that meant sending them somewhere. You couldn't just have 120 German rocket scientists wandering around Washington, D.C. or New York. They needed a place, a base of operations, somewhere they could build things and test things and not be asked too many questions. The Army found that place in the Deep South, a place called Huntsville, Alabama. Now picture Huntsville in 1950. It's a quiet, sleepy town. Cotton was king. The pace of life was slow, governed by the heat and the harvest. The biggest employer was a chemical plant that made fertilizer. This was not a center of cutting-edge technology. This was a place where the future, if it was coming at all, was moving at the speed of a passing freight train. And into this town, the Army began to move its new secret weapon, the German rocket team, led by Wernher von Braun. They were assigned to the Redstone Arsenal, a sprawling Army installation just outside of town. The locals knew the arsenal existed, of course. It had been a chemical weapons plant during the war. But now, something new was happening behind its fences. The first thing the people of Huntsville noticed was the accent. Suddenly, there were men in their stores, in their restaurants, with their families, speaking in thick, unmistakable German. They were polite, well-dressed. They had money. Their children were enrolled in the local schools. They were, for all intents and purposes, the new neighbors. But here's the part that should bother you. What did the people of Huntsville think? I mean, the war had ended less than 5 years earlier. American boys from Alabama had fought and died in Europe, in the Pacific. The images of concentration camps had been in every newsreel. The evil of the Nazi regime wasn't an abstract concept. It was the defining horror of a generation. And now, here were the men who built the V2, the weapon that rained down on London and Antwerp, a weapon of terror built by slaves. Here they were, buying groceries at the Piggly Wiggly, attending PTA meetings, joining the local Episcopal church. You'd think someone would have noticed, right? The official story, the one that filtered down from the Army to the city fathers, was simple. These were brilliant scientists. They were on our side now. They were the key to beating the Russians. They were building rockets for America. That was the narrative. And in a town that was about to get an enormous economic shot in the arm, it was a narrative that was very, very easy to accept. Because almost overnight, Huntsville began to change. The Army was pouring money into the Redstone Arsenal. New facilities sprang up. Engineers and technicians from all over the country were transferred in. Construction boomed. Jobs multiplied. That sleepy cotton town was waking up to the sound of bulldozers and the smell of rocket fuel. The Germans, for their part, played their roles perfectly. They were the charming, brilliant foreigners. Wernher von Braun, with his movie star looks and his fluent, eloquent English, became the public face of the American space program. He gave speeches. He wrote articles for Collier's magazine about space stations and trips to the moon. He was on television with Walt Disney, for God's sake. He wasn't a former Nazi officer. He was a visionary, a dreamer, our dreamer. But behind the public relations, the work was deadly serious, and it was moving at a breakneck pace. The team wasn't starting from scratch. They were starting from the V2. They were taking the weapon they had perfected at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, and they were Americanizing it. They called it the Redstone rocket. It was, in essence, a bigger, better V2. The first large ballistic missile in the American arsenal. Think about that for a second. The first weapon of its kind that America possessed was not an American invention. It was a direct descendant of a Nazi terror weapon, built by the men who created the original. The lineage was unbroken. The knowledge didn't cross the Atlantic in a briefcase. It crossed the Atlantic in the minds of the men who had used slave labor to apply it. And they were good at their jobs. Alarmingly good. The Redstone program moved with an efficiency that stunned the American officers overseeing it. These men had a single-minded focus. They had done this before. They knew how to solve the problems, the thrust, the guidance, the reentry. They had seen the failures. They had, quite literally, written the book. But it wasn't just about building a missile. It was about building a new reality. The Army, and by extension the U.S. government, was actively constructing a new identity for these men. They were no longer *Nazi scientists. They were *German scientists. Then they were just scientists. Then they were our scientists. The community in Huntsville became a little island of the recent past. They built their own club, the Von Braun Rocket Team Ski Club of all things. They socialized almost exclusively with each other. They spoke German at home. They celebrated German holidays. For their children, it was a strange duality. American schools by day, a transplanted German culture by night. A culture whose recent history was never, ever discussed. And the people of Huntsville, they made a quiet, collective decision. They looked the other way. The accents, the past, the unsettling questions, they were the price of admission to the future. The rocket was going to lift this town out of the cotton fields and into the space age. And you don't question the mechanics who are building your elevator to the stars. So a silence settled over it. A practical, prosperous silence. The men at the arsenal were building the future. What did it matter where they came from? That was the unspoken agreement. That was the deal. But here's where it gets weird. You can't just transplant 120 men and their families and expect their past to stay neatly filed away in a warehouse in Washington. It came with them, in their memories, in their habits, in the things they considered normal. The work culture they established at Redstone was intense. It was hierarchical in a way American engineers found foreign. It was demanding to the point of cruelty. The expectation was total devotion to the project. The project was everything. That ethos, the same one that had driven them at Peenemünde while prisoners died in the tunnels below, had taken root in the Alabama soil. They were building rockets for America now. But the blueprint, it turned out, wasn't just for the machines. It was for the mentality. The relentless, uncompromising, end justifies the means drive to achieve the objective, no matter the cost. And as the rockets grew taller on the test stands and the flames grew brighter, the town of Huntsville embraced its new identity. It was Rocket City, USA. The past was another country. But the men who built the future had brought a piece of that country with them, not in their luggage, but in their bones. And what they were building with that knowledge, well, that was just the beginning of what they brought home. So they were here. The new neighbors in Huntsville, the quiet men in the labs at Wright Field, the doctors with the unplaceable accents in Maryland. The files were scrubbed, the press had been steered away, the amnesia was convenient and total. The deal was done. The devil, as they say, was in the details, and now America had to live with him. But here's the part they never tell you. What they brought home wasn't just blueprints. It wasn't just equations for a bigger rocket or a faster jet. They imported an entire way of thinking, a methodology, a cold, utilitarian calculus that had been perfected in the most terrible laboratory imaginable. And that calculus didn't stay locked in a safe with the V2 schematics. It seeped out. Think about the first thing they did. They took those captured V2s, shipped them to White Sands, and started firing them into the sky over the American Southwest. Operation Paperclip's prize students were the ones running the show. Wernher von Braun and his team were there in the desert doing what they'd done at Peenemünde. Only now the uniforms were different. The funding came from a different treasury. The goal was science, upper atmosphere research, the beginnings of space exploration. A noble pivot, right? But you have to ask, what were the conditions? The rockets were assembled in part by German scientists and technicians who were, legally speaking, still prisoners of war. The technical data they used was compiled from the Mittelwerk, where thousands had died. Every launch was a ghost flight. Nobody said that. Nobody stood up at a press briefing and said, "The altitude data we're getting today is built on a foundation of slave labor." They just wrote down the numbers. They published the papers. They moved on to the next launch. And here's where it gets weird. While von Braun's team was firing rockets for the Army, other Paperclip imports were working on something else entirely. Over at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, and at other facilities, the chemical weapons program got a sudden, quiet upgrade. The men who had developed sarin and tabun for the Third Reich, who understood nerve agents in a way almost no one else on Earth did, were now on the payroll. Their expertise wasn't about reaching the stars. It was about perfecting the tools of human destruction on a scale that was almost clinical. The official line was always defensive research. We had to understand these weapons to develop countermeasures to protect our troops, and maybe that was even partly true. But the line between developing a defense and improving the offense is a blurry one. It's a technical line, and the men drawing it were the same ones who had already crossed every ethical line imaginable. You'd think someone would have asked for a second opinion, but nobody did, because the price had already been paid. It just wasn't paid by the men signing the checks. The real price was paid in silence. It was paid by the survivors of those underground factories who would watch as the architects of their misery became celebrated figures in a new country. It was paid by the families of the dead, who would see the men responsible for those deaths honored with awards and given platforms to talk about the future. It was paid in the currency of historical truth, which was carefully edited, redacted, and filed away. And it was paid, perhaps most insidiously, in the moral capital of the nation that had just won the war. We had defined ourselves against the Nazis. We were the ones who fought the monster. And then, before the ashes of the camps were even cold, we went into business with the monster's engineers. We didn't just hire them. We gave them security clearances. We gave them homes. We gave them our children to teach. Now this is the part nobody talks about. The immediate consequence wasn't just a rocket program. It was a precedent. It was a secret institutional handbook written in invisible ink. The handbook said, if the capability is valuable enough, the mind behind it is redeemable. It said, ethics are a luxury for peacetime. It said, the past is a country we don't have to visit if we don't want to. Just change the name on the file, burn the old photograph, forget the accent. That handbook got passed around. It informed decisions in the decades to come. When we needed to understand mind control, we found men who had experimented on prisoners. When we needed counterinsurgency tactics in dirty wars, we found men whose training came from a different kind of occupation. The pipeline didn't start with Paperclip, but Paperclip legitimized it. It made it a standard operating procedure. A quiet, bureaucratic devil's bargain signed in triplicate. So what changed? In the immediate aftermath, America changed. It gained a terrifying lead in rocket technology that would eventually lead to the moon. It gained a biological and chemical weapons knowledge base that would fuel a Cold War arms race. It gained a space program with a Nazi heart. But it lost something, too. It compromised the very principle it had just spent so much blood and treasure to defend. You look at the smiling photos from Huntsville in the 1950s, the backyard barbecues, the men who were building America's future. And you have to wonder, what were they thinking about when the sun went down? When the noise of the American day faded away? The story goes that many of them never spoke of the past. Not to their neighbors, not to their new colleagues. According to later accounts, it was a closed book. But a closed book has a weight. You can feel it on the shelf. They built the future, but they lived with ghosts. And so did the country that hired them. We all did. Because the victory parades had ended, the ticker tape was swept up, and a new, stranger, more ambiguous war was beginning. A Cold War. And in that war, the men from Paperclip weren't a hidden shame anymore. They were a strategic asset. We were going to celebrate them. We were going to put them on television. Which leads us to the next, and perhaps most unsettling, question of all. When the cameras finally turned on, and the whole country was watching, what story did we tell ourselves about who these men were, and how they got here? So the deal was done. The men were here. The rockets were being drawn on American chalkboards. And back home, the victory parades were winding down. You had ticker tape in the gutters and a flag in every window. You had the boys coming home, or at least the ones who made it. And you had a story everyone could understand. We won. The good guys beat the bad guys. The world was safe for democracy. It was clean. It was simple. It was the story you told your kids so they could sleep at night. But here's the part that should bother you. It's the silence in the middle of all that noise. The questions that nobody was asking. Not in the newspapers, not in Congress, and certainly not in the speeches from the grandstands. Think about what the public knew. They knew we'd fought a war against a regime built on a foundation of monstrous ideology. They knew that regime had enslaved millions, experimented on the living, industrialized murder. They knew we'd captured the brains behind their most terrifying weapons. The V-2 rockets that fell on London weren't a secret. The slave labor that built them in the Mittelwerk tunnels, that was coming out in bits and pieces at the Nuremberg trials, which were happening at the very same time asterisk. So you'd have to ask, where did all those brains go? That's the unasked question. It hangs over every parade, every celebration of our technological might. We're throwing a party for winning the race, and nobody thinks to check if we just hired the other team's star runner. Or worse, their coach, who also happened to run the torture drills. The men who paid the price, the first price, the blood price, were still fresh in memory. The infantrymen who fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, the bomber crew who flew through flak over Schweinfurt, the prisoner of war who starved in a stalag. What was the through line for them? You fight, you suffer, you lose friends to a weapon, and then your country buys the man who perfected that weapon, gives him a house, a salary, a new life. The through line is broken. It doesn't connect, so it wasn't talked about. And the government, of course, had no interest in connecting those dots. The official stance was a masterclass in compartmentalization. Over here, at the war crimes trials, we are prosecuting the evils of the Nazi state. We are establishing, for history, the principle of individual accountability. Over their asterisk, at the Army's secret offices in Maryland and Texas, we are signing employment contracts with individuals who served that state. The left hand was building a gallows. The right hand was offering a signing bonus. They weren't hypocrites. Not in their own minds, they were pragmatists. The war was over. The next war was already taking shape in the chalk dust of the map rooms. The Soviet shadow was long, and in that shadow, old sins were given new names. They were war crimes anymore. They were regrettable wartime exigencies. A man wasn't a mass murderer if he could explain the ballistics of an intercontinental rocket. But this created a quiet, persistent pressure, a kind of moral tinnitus, a high-pitched hum of wrongness that you could only hear in the silence. It had to be managed, so the suppression wasn't always dramatic. It wasn't about men in black suits burning files, though that happened. It was about tone. It was about access. It was about steering the conversation. When a journalist got too close, as we talked about earlier, they weren't always threatened. They were often educated asterisk. A quiet background briefing from a sympathetic colonel. "Look, son," the briefing would go. "The world is a dangerous place. We have a new enemy. These men, whatever they were, are keys to our survival. Do you want to give those keys to the Russians? Do you want to be the one who makes us lose this new race before it even starts?" The appeal wasn't to greed. It was to fear. And to patriotism. It was a powerful silencer. And what about the scientists themselves, the ones now living on army bases with their families? They felt the pressure too, but from the other side. The deal was sanctuary for service. But the service required a kind of historical amnesia. To be of use, they had to be reborn as pure technicians. Men whose work existed in a vacuum, separate from the world that created it. They had to talk about trajectories and thrust-to-weight ratios and metallurgy. They could not talk about the source of the metals. They could not talk about the faces of the men who mined it. This created a strange, schizophrenic existence. They were building the future for their new country while systematically walling off their past. Every conversation was a potential minefield. A misplaced word, a remembered anecdote, a slip of the tongue about the old days at Peenemünde could lead to a place nobody wanted to go. So they didn't go there. They worked. They focused on the math. The math was clean. The math had no ghosts. Back in Germany, the landscape was rubble. And in that rubble, other people were asking questions. Survivors, displaced persons, investigators for the trials. They were looking for names, for faces, for the men who ran the underground factories, and some of those names were on passenger manifests to New York. Some of those faces were now eating in American cafeterias. When inquiries were made, official, legal inquiries from Allied prosecutors, the responses from Washington were slow. They were bureaucratic. Files were unavailable. Subjects were under contract, and their whereabouts were a matter of ongoing operational security. The message, delivered in dry officialese, was clear: hands off. These assets are ours now. The debt you wish to collect has been transferred to a different ledger. So what changed in the immediate aftermath? On the surface, nothing. The sun rose. The parades ended. Life went on. But underneath, a fundamental bargain had been struck. A precedent was set, not in law but in practice. It said that certain crimes, if attached to certain useful knowledge, could be rendered moot. Not forgiven exactly, just archived, placed in a locked room while business was conducted next door. The price of justice was deemed too high if the currency was scientific advantage. And the American public, for the most part, slept through it. They were exhausted. They were building suburbs and having babies and buying cars. They wanted to look forward, not backward. The narrative of Nazi geniuses working for us was, when it occasionally leaked, often spun as a kind of triumph. We were so good, so magnanimous, that we could even turn our enemies into assets. See, we won so completely, we even won asterisk them over. Nobody asked what we had to become to do that winning. The victory was absolute. But the silence that followed, the silence where the hard questions should have been, that silence was where the real cost was piling up. It was a debt, not a financial one, a moral one. And like all debts, it would sit there, gathering interest in the dark, waiting for someone someday to open the ledger. Because here's the thing about bringing something home that isn't just blueprints. You bring home the choices that made them. You bring home the excuses. You bring home the habit of looking the other way. And you install it in your own house. You make it part of your own foundation. The unasked questions at the victory parades, they don't just fade away. They become the questions you're no longer allowed to ask about what comes next. And what came next was a ledger so full, so heavy with names and numbers and secrets, that opening it would threaten to collapse the whole story they'd built. The story of the clean, righteous victory. That ledger's title. You could call it the debt that could never be publicly acknowledged asterisk. And we're about to see who exactly was expected to pay it. So the scientists were here. The rockets were flying, the public was cheering, and the files, the really bad ones, were locked away in a drawer marked personnel historical. The deal was done. But a deal like this, it doesn't just end. It accrues interest. A quiet, compounding interest paid not in dollars but in compromises, in secrets that start to whisper, in a debt that could never, ever be publicly acknowledged. And the first payment came due almost immediately. It was a simple, brutal transaction. You give us your minds, we give you our protection. And that protection had to be absolute, which meant when someone came asking, the answer was always no, even when the someone was us. Take the case of Arthur Rudolph. We've talked about him. The operations director at Middlework, where thousands died building V-2 rockets. By the mid-1950s, he was a cornerstone of the American missile program at Huntsville, a NASA man. An American hero in the making. But in 1947, the U.S. Army itself had compiled a dossier on him. It stated, clearly, that he should be prosecuted as a war criminal. That file went into the Paperclip black hole. But what happens when another branch of the American government starts digging? The Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, was created in 1979 to hunt Nazis on American soil. They were the good guys, finally asking the questions that should have been asked in 1945. And when they pulled Arthur Rudolph's name, they found a trail. They interviewed survivors. They read the old, forgotten reports. They built a case. And here's the part that should bother you. They didn't get a fight. They didn't get a cover-up. They got something far more efficient, a negotiation. The OSI went to NASA and the Justice Department and laid out what they had. And the response, according to the later accounts, was essentially, okay, but how do we make this go away without a trial? A public trial would be a catastrophe. It would expose the whole rotten foundation of the space program. It would ask the American public to look directly at the man who helped put us on the moon and see the man who oversaw a slave labor factory. So they cut a deal. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph sat down with the U.S. government. not in a courtroom, in a quiet room. They presented him with a choice: renounce his American citizenship and leave the country voluntarily, or face deportation proceedings that would air everything. He took the deal. He left. He was stripped of his citizenship. And the official statement was a masterpiece of sterile language. He left to avoid, quote, the turmoil and expense of litigation. Not a word about what the litigation would have revealed. He moved back to Germany, and the German government, after a cursory look, declined to prosecute. Why? The evidence, they said, was insufficient, a neat, closed loop. Justice was served technically. The bad guy was gone, and the American public never learned why. The debt was paid with silence, but Rudolph was just one name. The protection was systemic. It was in the security clearances granted to men whose pasts were literal minefields. It was in the promotions, the awards, the comfortable retirements. Every time a paperclip scientist was given a new contract, every time his background check was lost or inconclusive, the debt grew. And it wasn't just about protecting them from prosecutors. It was about protecting their work from scrutiny. Their research became our asterisk research. Their methods became our asterisk methods. And some of those methods were problematic. We talked about the other things they were working on. The aviation medicine, the high-altitude studies, the data that came from places without ethical review boards. When that data was folded into American research, it created a stain of provenance. A military doctor in the 1960s studying G-force tolerance might be building on a data set that came from experiments where the human subjects didn't have a choice. Did he know? Maybe not. But the institution did. The debt here was intellectual. We owed our progress in some small, terrible way to crimes. And acknowledging that would have unraveled not just a few careers, but the moral authority of entire fields of science. So the rule was simple: don't ask. And if someone asks you, you don't know. You'd think in the open society America was supposed to be that this would crack. That a journalist, a historian, a whistleblower would shatter it. But the Cold War was a powerful insulator. The enemy was real. The threat was existential. And when you're in a race for survival, you don't stop to audit the moral credentials of your engineers. You just ask if the rocket works. The debt was paid in the currency of the era: paranoia. The very secrecy needed to hide the scientists' pasts became a habit, a reflex. It bled into everything. It justified lies told to Congress. It created a class of government insiders who knew that the official story was a facade, and that maintaining that facade was the highest national priority. It taught a generation of intelligence officers that some truths are too dangerous for democracy. You draw your own conclusions about what that lesson led to in Vietnam, in Central America, in the decades that followed. And the greatest, most public payment on this debt was also the most ironic. July 16, 1969. The Saturn V rocket, the brainchild of Wernher von Braun and his team, lifts off for the moon. America watches, breathless. We did it. We beat the Soviets. The ultimate symbol of American ingenuity, of peaceful triumph. But look at that rocket. Really look at it. Its direct ancestor is the V-2. Its chief architect is a man who, 15 years earlier, was building weapons for Hitler with slave labor. The technology that terrorized London was the foundation for the technology that awed the world. The debt was right there, in the sky, for everyone to see. And nobody mentioned it. The broadcasters didn't. The politicians didn't. The history books wouldn't. The celebration required a collective, willful amnesia. To enjoy the triumph, we had to forget the price. That's the real debt. It wasn't just a file of secrets. It was a mortgage on our national memory. We borrowed the future by pawning the past. And the monthly payment was a little more silence, a little more forgetting, a little more acceptance that some men were simply too useful to be held accountable. But debts have a way of coming due, and the collectors aren't always from the OSI. Sometimes they're just ghosts, the kind that don't haunt houses but machines. The kind that wait in the quiet hum of a system built on a hidden fault line. Because what happens when the men who knew all the secrets, who carried the true cost in their silence, finally leave the control room? What do they leave behind in the blueprints, in the protocols, in the very culture of the institutions they built? That's when you meet them. Not the scientists, the ghosts they built into the machine. So the men were here. The rockets were flying. The public story was a neat little bow about German ingenuity being repurposed for American progress. But you don't just bring over 160 men from the heart of the Nazi war machine and expect the past to stay politely in the past. It doesn't work that way. The ghosts came with them, and they didn't haunt attics or old castles. They took up residence in the most modern place imaginable, the control room. Think about it. You're a young American engineer, fresh out of college, maybe you fought in the Pacific. You're assigned to work on the future, the V2 derivatives, the redstone, the stuff that's going to take us to space. And your boss, the man who signs off on your calculations, the one whose word is final on the firing sequence, he used to sit in a very similar room in Peenemünde. Only his rockets weren't aimed at the upper atmosphere. They were aimed at London, at Antwerp, at city centers packed with civilians. He heard the same tense countdowns, watched the same kind of dials spike, felt the same rumble through the floor. But the outcome he was monitoring was the sound of an explosion hundreds of miles away and the casualty reports that would follow. Now he's here in Florida, and he's your superior. That's not a historical footnote. That's the atmosphere. That's the air people were breathing. The technical knowledge was transferred, absolutely. But so was the culture, the mindset. A certain coldness of calculation. The American engineers who worked alongside them in Huntsville and at the Cape would talk about it later in private. The Paperclip men had a different way of working. It was hierarchical, rigid. Questioning the senior men wasn't just discouraged, it was treated as a kind of insubordination. The chain of command was everything. Sound familiar? It was the Prussian military model, transplanted directly onto the American space program. And the jokes. There were always the jokes. Dark, offhand remarks about the old days. Anecdotes about shortages, about the middlework factory, told with a grim chuckle that didn't invite follow-up questions. You'd be calibrating a gyroscope, and the man next to you, a man whose name you now know was on a payroll hidden deep in Army files, would muse about how they solved a similar vibration problem on the A4, using parts manufactured under very different conditions. He'd let the sentence hang. You, pretend you didn't hear it. What were you supposed to do? This was the daily reality. The moral debt wasn't a line in a classified memo. It was in the break room. It was in the way a conversation would suddenly go quiet when you walked in. It was in the personnel files that listed a vacation back to Germany for a man who was, in reality, being deposed in a war crimes investigation that would ultimately go nowhere. Everyone knew, and everyone chose not to know. But the past has a way of knocking. It doesn't always come as a prosecutor with a subpoena. Sometimes it comes as a journalist with a few good sources. Sometimes it comes as a letter to a congressman from a citizen who remembers a name from a newsreel. And sometimes it comes as a man in a uniform standing on American soil, giving a straight-armed salute. That's what happened in 1960. At a party in Huntsville, a gathering for one of the German scientists. And when a song from the old country was played, a drinking song that had, over time, become associated with Nazi loyalty, a decorated U.S. Army officer who had worked under Werner von Braun stood up, and he gave the Nazi salute. The story got out. Of course it got out. It was too loud, too public, too blatant to sweep under the rug. The Army had to respond. They conducted an investigation. And what did they find? They found that the officer was emotionally upset at the time, that it was a cultural misunderstanding, that he was just being nostalgic for a folk song. He was reprimanded, gently, and that was that. But ask yourself, what does that moment tell you? It tells you that after 15 years in the United States, after becoming a naturalized citizen, after working on the most prestigious projects this country could offer, the old allegiance wasn't dead. It was dormant. A familiar tune could wake it right up. And it wasn't just him. Nobody at that table stopped him. Nobody stood up and said, "Not here, not ever." They let it happen. They were complicit in the silence that followed. That's the price that was being paid day by day. The corrosion of principle. The quiet acceptance that some men were simply too valuable to be held to the same standard as everyone else. Their past was a locked room, and everyone had agreed to pretend they'd lost the key. But the key was there. It was in the files back in Germany. Files that detailed their memberships, their activities, their signatures on documents that authorized things no one wanted to speak of. And in the mid-1960s, a researcher for the West German government started turning that key. His name was Klaus. He wasn't a prosecutor. He was a bureaucrat, compiling records for denazification tribunals that were, by then, largely ceremonial. But he was thorough, and his list of active Nazi Party members started crossing paths with the list of paperclip scientists living comfortably in America. He did what a bureaucrat does. He sent the information to the proper authorities. In this case, the U.S. Department of Justice. "Here is the evidence," he said. "Here are the party numbers, the dates of membership, the SS affiliations you said didn't exist." And what did the Justice Department do? They buried it. They didn't dispute it. They didn't launch new investigations. They took Klaus's meticulous, damning work and they filed it away. They knew that to act on it would mean arresting or deporting the very men who were, at that very moment, leading the charge to beat the Soviets to the moon. It would be a scandal of unimaginable scale. It would admit that the entire foundation of the space race was morally compromised. So they chose the future over the past. Again, the ghosts weren't just in the control room. They were in the filing cabinets at the Department of Justice. They were in the quiet understanding between government agencies that some truths are too expensive to ever see the light. So the rockets kept flying. Apollo took shape. And the men who had once worked for Hitler aimed for a celestial target, cheered on by a nation that had no idea who was really at the helm. The public got a triumphant narrative of American know-how. The government got its missiles and its moon shots. And the paperclip men got the one thing they'd bargained for, a permanent, absolute escape from judgment. If you're the kind of person who likes knowing what really happened, subscribe. We dig into a new American mystery every single night. But that escape, it wasn't free. The bill was coming due, not in a court of law, but in the soul of the projects they built. Because when you make a deal, you live with the terms. And we were about to find out that the bargain we'd struck in the ashes of World War II was the one we're still living with today. So here we are, the end of the story, or rather the beginning of the silence. The rockets flew, the moon was reached. The Cold War was in some twisted way won, and the men who made it possible grew old in American suburbs, tended their gardens, collected their pensions, and were buried with honors. The official histories were written, and in those histories a certain alchemy took place. The past was not erased. That would be too crude, too obvious. It was asterisk transmuted asterisk. The hard, jagged, morally complicated facts were run through a furnace of national purpose and came out the other side as a smooth, polished narrative of triumph. It became a story about brains, not souls, about hardware, not history, about what we gained, never about what we agreed to overlook. You'll find it in the textbooks if you look. A paragraph, maybe two. Operation Paperclip. They'll say it was a program to bring German scientists to America after World War II. They'll say these men were valuable to our space and missile programs. They might even mention Wernher von Braun by name. And then the text will hurry along to the next thing, the Apollo program, Sputnik, the space race. The story becomes one of competition, of American ingenuity with a little borrowed help. The help, of course, had no shadows. The help had no names on a dotted line at Middle Bowdora. The help never signed a letter recommending the elimination of a human being. In the official record, the help is just expertise. Neutral, technical, clean. And that's the bargain we're still living with. The one etched in invisible ink beneath every plaque at the Smithsonian, every documentary about the Saturn V, every proud recitation of how we beat the Russians to the moon. The bargain says, we will take this magnificent, world-altering achievement, and in exchange, we will agree to never fully account for its cost. We will separate the sin from the sinner, the art from the artist, the rocket from the factory where it was first imagined by men who walked past hanged prisoners on their way to the drafting table. We agreed to call it a necessary evil. But here's the part that should bother you. When does an evil stop being necessary? When the first V-2 hits London. When the first Redstone is test-fired. When Armstrong takes his step. Or does the necessity linger as long as the technology remains useful, as long as the story remains flattering to tell? The legacy is in the language. We speak of Nazi scientists as a category, a group. It lets us off the hook. A group is faceless. But Paperclip was never about a group. It was about individuals. It was about specific men with specific files and specific decisions made about them, one by one in quiet rooms. Arthur Rudolph, the operations director for the Saturn V, was a named individual. His past was known. And when it finally became too inconvenient in the 1980s, he was allowed to leave the country quietly rather than face a messy trial. The bargain held. Protect the legacy, avoid the scandal. The legacy is in the archives, too, or rather in their stubborn gaps, files that were lost, records that were destroyed in routine housekeeping, witness statements that contradict the smooth biography written by a public relations officer. For decades, researchers and journalists hit walls. The story was compartmentalized, not just for security, but for reputation. The men were assets, and you protect your assets. So what are we left with? We're left with a national achievement that is both genuinely glorious and profoundly stained. We got to the moon on a road paved by a deal with the devil, and we've spent the better part of a century trying to convince ourselves that the devil was just a tough negotiator. You live with this legacy every time you look up at the night sky, every time you feel a swell of pride at what American engineering can do. That feeling is real, but it's not pure. It's layered over with the ghost of a moral compromise so vast, we decided to build it into the foundation of our modern world. and then pretend the foundation wasn't there. Nobody ever built a monument to the bargain. There's no statue in Washington, D.C. to the men who made the list, who signed the visas, who decided that some crimes could be weighed against future utility and found not light exactly, but negotiable asterisk. There's no plaque that says, "Here began the tradition of looking the other way for a technological edge." But the absence of a monument is its own kind of statement. It tells you what a country chooses to remember and what it desperately hopes you'll forget. We built temples to the rockets. We named schools after the engineers. We wrote the triumphant version into 1,000 documentaries. The other version, the one with the smell of burning paper, the blank spaces in the personnel files, the unasked questions in the victory parades, that version lives in footnotes. In the quiet work of historians who piece together the story from the fragments left behind. In the stubborn questions asked by the children of the victims who look at the celebratory footage and see a different story entirely. We made a choice. We chose the rocket over the reckoning. We chose the future, we told ourselves, over the past. But the past has a way of sticking to things. It doesn't wash off. It becomes part of the alloy, stronger maybe, but always with that trace element of something darker fused into its structure. And so the bargain endures. We live in the world it built. We benefit from the technology it secured. And we inherit the quiet, unresolved question, was it worth it? That's a question every generation has to answer for itself. But you can't answer it honestly if you don't know the full price of the ticket. We've been handed a receipt with half the items smudged out. Which brings us to the final, silent partner in all of this. The one who got no rockets, no moon landings, no triumphant parades. Just the memory and the insistence that some things shouldn't be bargained away at all. The next section isn't about scientists or spies or governments. It's about the empty space where a different kind of memorial was supposed to be. It's about the statue we never built asterisk. And the reason you've never seen it tells you everything about what we decided was truly important. So here we are at the end of the story, or at least at the point where the story gets buried. The bargain was struck, the scientists were integrated, the rockets flew. The Cold War demanded its victories, and we got them. But history isn't just what happens, it's what we choose to remember, and more importantly, what we choose to forget. And that brings us to the statue we never built. You see, after a war, you build monuments. You carve names in marble. You cast bronze statues of your heroes. It's how a nation processes victory and loss. It's how it tells itself a coherent story about what it did and why. For the men of Operation Paperclip, the story America needed to tell was one of brilliant, apolitical minds, harnessed for freedom. The narrative was clean. We got the brains, we beat the Soviets, the end. But to tell that story cleanly, you have to leave a lot of things out. You have to build a monument with a very specific, very limited view. Think about it. In Huntsville, Alabama, Rocket City, USA, they have a U.S. Space and Rocket Center. There's a Saturn V laid on its side. There are plaques and exhibits. The contributions of Wernher von Braun and his team are documented, technically, in the context of the space race. But it's a museum of engineering. It's a celebration of the machine. The story of the men is sanitized, streamlined, presented as a neat arc. German rocketeers, American rockets, moon landing. The difficult, ugly, human middle of that story, the how, the why, the cost, gets smoothed over. It's not etched in bronze anywhere. Now imagine for a second an alternate timeline. One where in the late 1940s or early 1950s, Someone in the State Department or the Army had proposed a public monument to the Paperclip scientists. A statue in a park in Washington or outside the Pentagon. A grand gesture of gratitude. What would that statue have looked like? It couldn't have been a statue of them as they were. You couldn't have a bronze figure in an SS uniform or even a German Wehrmacht uniform standing on American soil as a hero. That was the whole problem, wrapped in one impossible image. So the statue would have had to be a lie. It would have shown them not as they were, but as we needed them to be. Men in crisp, modern American suits, perhaps gazing hopefully at a stylized rocket, their pasts erased, their political identities neutered. The monument wouldn't commemorate who they were, but who we pretended they were. And maybe, on some level, the people in charge knew that a statue like that would be a silent, permanent accusation. A constant, stone reminder of the bargain. So they never built it. Instead, we built other things. We built the rockets. We built the NASA campuses. We built the mythology of the space race as a pure, noble contest of intellect and courage. We built a legacy of technology so dazzling, so literally out of this world, that it cast a very long, very dark shadow over its origins. And what of the other side of that legacy? The statue we really never built. There is no official American monument to the victims of Mittelwerk. No plaque at Cape Canaveral with the names of the slaves who died building the V-2's ancestor. Their suffering is not part of our national story of triumph, because officially, it wasn't our sin. We just inherited the fruits of it. We left that memory in Europe, in the overgrown tunnels of the Harz Mountains, a ghost story from another country's past. A convenient separation. This is how history gets buried, not with a shout but with a strategic silence. Not by destroying records, though that happened too, but by controlling the narrative. By deciding what gets a plaque and what gets a footnote. By teaching the rocket equation in schools, but not the moral calculus that brought its masters here. You want to know the long-term consequence? It's this nagging, national doublethink. We can watch a Saturn V launch archive footage and feel a swell of patriotic pride. And in the very next breath, we can read a declassified memo about denazification, waivers, and feel a cold knot in the stomach. We hold both truths at once. We've never reconciled them. We've just learned to live with the dissonance. This legacy shows up in the way we talk about technology itself. The Paperclip story cemented this idea that scientific genius exists in a vacuum, that the brain is separable from the soul, that you can take the tool and leave the hand that wielded it. It's a seductive idea, especially for a nation engaged in a global struggle. It lets you ask, what can this person build for us? Instead of what did this person do? It turns morality into a bureaucratic checkbox. A problem of paperwork, not of conscience. And this mindset, it didn't end in 1945. It just found new targets, new conflicts, new necessary bargains. You see echoes of it later in other alliances of convenience. In the way we've sometimes dealt with warlords or dictators or cyber mercenaries. The principle is the same. Look at the capability, downplay the character. The Paperclip playbook became a quiet, unspoken part of the national security toolkit. So what remains unresolved? Everything that wasn't written down. Every conversation that happened in a closed office with no stenographer. Every moment of private doubt a Paperclip scientist might have had in the middle of the night in a suburban American home. Every victim at Mittelwerk whose family never got an apology, let alone compensation, from the nation that later employed their killer's boss. The historical record is a patchwork. We have the employment files. We have the technical reports. We have the triumphant press releases from NASA. What we don't have is the full human truth. We don't have the ledger that weighs the moonshot against the memory of a starving prisoner assembling a guidance system. That calculation was never meant to be public. It was the secret heart of the deal. In the end, the statue we never built is the most honest monument of all. Its absence speaks volumes. It tells you that some chapters of history are too conflicted, too morally ambiguous to be cast in bronze and set in a park. They have to live in the shadows of our achievements, in the quiet spaces between the lines of our textbooks. We commemorate the rocket. We bury the reason we have its designer. We're left with a legacy of breathtaking horizons built on a foundation of willful blindness. And we've never really decided if the trade was worth it. We just agreed as a country to stop asking the question. But that agreement, that silent, collective decision to look forward and not back, it taught us a very specific and very dangerous lesson about how to win. And that lesson, the one we pretend we learned for just that one desperate moment, is the one we've been quietly applying ever since. So here we are at the part of the story where we're supposed to have learned something. That's how history works, right? A terrible thing happens, we look at it, we study it, we say, never again. And then we close the book. The lesson is learned, the moral is clear, we move on, wiser for the experience. But what if the lesson was never really learned? What if it was just performed? Think about how this story entered the public record. For years, it was a whisper, a rumor, a thing denied at the highest levels. Then, slowly, in the 1970s and 80s, the documents started to trickle out. Not because of a sudden commitment to transparency, but because of pressure. Because researchers and journalists kept pulling at loose threads. The government's hand was forced. They had to admit the broad outline, but they could still control the narrative. And the narrative they settled on was one of grim, pragmatic necessity. A tough choice made in a dangerous time. The official histories, the ones that finally acknowledged Paperclip, framed it as a cold calculus. We had to do it, they said. The Soviets were doing it. The alternative was falling behind. It was a lesser evil. That became the lesson. Not a moral lesson, but a strategic one. The takeaway was we should never bargain with monsters. It was, sometimes, to win, you have to get your hands dirty. The lesson was about winning, not about virtue. And in that framing, the scientists themselves underwent a quiet transformation. In the public telling, they became depoliticized. They became brains on sticks. Brilliant, apolitical minds who just happened to be working for the wrong team. The story focused on the rockets, the aerodynamics, the chemistry. It separated the intellect from the man who wielded it. Wernher von Braun, the most public face, became a genial, dreamy space prophet. His past was a footnote, an unfortunate detail on an otherwise stellar resume. The system that produced him, the slave labor, the SS membership, the direct service to a genocidal regime, faded into a blurry background. We didn't get a statue, like we talked about last time, but we did get a plaque. We got museum exhibits that celebrated the engineering triumph while glossing over the human cost. We got textbooks that mentioned Operation Paperclip in a paragraph, sandwiched between the Marshall Plan and the Berlin airlift, another logistical maneuver of the Cold War. The messy, screaming moral conflict was buried under the clean, silent language of geopolitics. And here's the part that should bother you. That burial was a choice. It was an active, deliberate editing of the story to make it more palatable, to make us more comfortable with our inheritance. Because the real, uncomfortable lesson of Paperclip isn't about the past. It's about the present. It's about how easily principle bends before the altar of perceived advantage. It's about how a nation can tell itself a story about its own righteousness while quietly making deals in the shadows that contradict every value it claims to hold in the light. The lesson we pretend we learned is that it was a one-time thing. A unique artifact of a uniquely terrifying moment. The dawn of the atomic age, the sudden vacuum of a fallen enemy, the rise of a new ideological foe. But that's not true. The pattern didn't end. It just changed its name. It changed its targets. Think about the Cold War proxies, the authoritarian regimes we supported because they were anti-communist. The militaries we trained and equipped, fully aware of their human rights records. The intelligence we shared with questionable allies. The rationale was always the same. They're not good, but they're on our side. And the other side is worse. It's the exact same calculus. The lesser evil. The necessary bargain. Paperclip wasn't an aberration. It was a blueprint. It established a precedent. A quiet understanding within the national security state that when the stakes are high enough, the files can be cleaned, the past can be whitewashed, and people can be reduced to their utility. Their humanity and the humanity of their victims becomes a secondary concern. We like to believe that after something like the Holocaust, the world drew a bright, clear line. That we said, this is beyond the pale. These people are irredeemable. Their knowledge is tainted. But Paperclip proves that line was drawn in sand, and the first strong wind blew it away. The wind was called expediency. So the legacy isn't just in our rockets or our nerve gas stockpiles or our space program. The legacy is in the muscle memory of our institutions. The knowledge that it can be done, that the press can be managed, that Congress can be kept in the dark, that the public can be told a soothing story, and that history can be written later to justify the means. What remains unresolved today is the debt. Not the debt to those specific men. Most of them are long dead. But the debt to the idea we supposedly fought for. The debt to the principle that some things are so wrong that they disqualify you from the victor's circle. We never really settled that account. We just deferred it. We kicked it down the road, and it compounds interest with every subsequent necessary bargain, every new alliance of convenience with someone whose hands are just as dirty as the last guy's. We ended up with a history that is technically accurate but morally hollow. We have the dates, the names, the rocket specifications, but we lost the weight of the choice. We turned a Faustian bargain into a personnel decision. The lesson we pretend we learned is that it was hard, but it was worth it. The lesson we actually learned and keep relearning is how to look the other way. How to build a monument to the triumph while quietly sweeping the cost under the foundation. And you have to wonder, if that's the real lesson, the one etched into the institutional DNA, not the pretty one in the school books, then what does that mean for the next time? When the next list is drawn up, when the next necessary evil walks through the door, offering the next world-changing technology in exchange for a clean slate. Because the most unsettling thing about Paperclip isn't that it happened once in the chaotic aftermath of a world war. It's that the machinery for it still exists. The people who know how to do it are still here. The justifications are still on file, and the only thing that might be missing is the list itself, which makes you wonder, what if there was another one? A list nobody talks about, names we never heard. A bargain made not in the smoky aftermath of victory, but in the silent, ongoing shadow war that never really ended. Stay with me for one last story. Because before we close this book for good, we need to talk about the names that weren't on von Braun's manifest. The ones filed somewhere else under a different project name. We need to talk about the other list, still sealed asterisk. So here we are, at the end of the list. We've followed the paper trail, such as it is, from the burning files of Peenemünde to the quiet suburbs of Huntsville. We've talked about the rockets, the amnesia, the ghosts in the control room, the bargain. But you don't bury something this big with just one list. The list we know, the one with von Braun and his rocket team, the one that became the foundation of NASA, that was the public list. The one they could, eventually, with enough polish and patriotic varnish, explain away. The necessary men for a necessary fight. The brain power we couldn't afford to lose to the Soviets. It had a logic to it, however cold. A geopolitical alibi. But Paperclip was never just about rockets. You know that by now. It was about chemistry, metallurgy, aviation medicine, psychology, weaponry. The entire dark catalog of Nazi industrial science. And for those other fields, the ones with no shiny moon landing payoff, the ones that dealt in things you don't put in a museum, they needed a different system. A quieter one. That's where the other list comes in. The story goes that there were two lists, maybe more, running in parallel. One was managed by the Joint Chiefs for the obvious military prizes. The other was handled by different agencies for different kinds of assets. The men whose work was so morally stained, or so strategically sensitive, that their very existence in America had to be deniable, even to other parts of the government. Think about the doctor we talked about earlier. The one who never was. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a template. How many others were given that treatment? A new name, a fabricated past, a job in a private sector lab or a tucked-away university department funded through a maze of cutouts and front organizations. Their expertise didn't vanish. It just went underground, into private aerospace, into pharmaceutical research, into the burgeoning world of chemical and biological defense. Which, as anyone in that world will tell you, is a line so thin it's often invisible. Nobody confirmed this, but the logic is there in the gaps, in the files that are still not found, in the personnel records that end abruptly with transferred and no forwarding address. The other list wasn't written on paper meant to be seen. It was etched in whispers and handshake deals. It was the real price of the bargain, the one we're still paying, but can't find the receipt for. And this is the part that should bother you. It's not just about hiding Nazis. It's about what their presence did to the architecture of American secrecy itself. Paperclip didn't just import scientists. It imported a methodology. A European Gestapo-style comfort with compartmentalization, with moral flexibility in the name of state interest. It taught a young CIA and a growing military intelligence complex how to do it better, how to hide people, how to launder histories, how to build a wall between what is done and what is known. The legacy of Paperclip is the playbook. The lesson learned wasn't never again. It was how to do it again without getting caught. You can draw a straight line from the quiet resettlements of 1946 to the MK Ultra experiments of the 1950s and 60s, experiments that used methodologies pioneered in Nazi camps. The same moral blank space, just with different letterhead. The men who knew how to push the limits of the human mind, because they'd already broken it, found new employers. They just stopped using German. So how does a story like this end? It doesn't. It gets buried. Officially. In the 1980s, under pressure, the government launched something called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. A final attempt to clear the air, to find every last skeleton. A team of historians was given unprecedented access to go looking for the other list, for the full accounting. They spent years at it. And what they found, and more importantly what they didn't find, tells you everything. They found traces, shadows on carbon paper, memos referencing evaluations of men who should never have been evaluated. They confirmed that the scope was wider, much wider than the rocket men. But the actual lists, the master rosters, the files that named names and destinations, gone, destroyed in routine record purges, lost in transfers between agencies that somehow never got logged. The official historian on the project, a man named Richard Breitman, said the record was fragmentary and opaque. That's historian code for someone made sure we'd never get the whole picture. The archive, in the end, is a monument to absence. It shows you the shape of the whole, which brings us to today, to what's left. There's a file, one specific file pulled from the chaos of the post-war intelligence scramble. It's held by the CIA. Its subject is simply German scientists. It's not the other list, but those who have seen fragments believe it's the index, the guide that might point to where the lists were or how the system worked. That file is still sealed, fully. Not a single page has been released. The CIA's position is that its disclosure could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Think about that. We're approaching 8 decades since the end of the war. The scientists are all dead. The Soviet Union is gone. What, in a file about recruiting German scientists in 1947, could possibly cause exceptionally grave damage today? Only 2 things. 1, it would reveal the true, grotesque extent of who we brought in and what we knowingly overlooked. The names we still protect. The institutions, maybe even companies that were built with that tainted knowledge. 2, and this is the darker possibility, it would reveal that the system never ended. That the mechanisms created for Paperclip, the false identities, the laundered pasts, the secret funding channels, were too useful to retire. That they were used again, for other people, from other conflicts. That we're still living inside the machine it built. That's the unresolved question that hangs in the air, heavier than any rocket. It's not about what we did in 1945. It's about what we became because of it. The statue we never built is a monument to our own complicated conscience. The lesson we pretend we learned is a fairy tale we tell ourselves so the lights stay on. We traded a clear-eyed view of our own history for a head start in the next war. And in doing so, we made the moral calculus of the Cold War. The ends justify any asterisk means, the foundational logic of our national security state. The ghost in the machine isn't a person, it's a principle. The principle that some knowledge is worth any price, and that the price itself can be buried so deep we forget we ever paid it. The other list is still out there, not on paper, in the silence, in the gaps in the archive, in the file that remains sealed, not to protect the past, but to protect the present from seeing its own reflection too clearly. Sleep well. Tomorrow night, we've got another one for you.